I'm going to call to order Environmental Matters Committee meeting for October 17th. And for the record, all the members are in attendance. So first of all, I want to do an approval of the minutes.
Move approval of minutes.
I second approval.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. That motion passes. And we're going to skip over the development update because we have a lot on the agenda for today. And so we're also I'm going to change the order a bit. We're going to start with O3518, pruning of trees. I think we can get this one out of the way pretty quickly. Director Gild, would you be willing to take a seat at the table? We'll ask you. We may have some questions about this one. Can you give us just a brief justification for this ordinance? The O3518. Thank you. Please state your name.
Do you mind if I go over it? Hi, this is Brian Adams, City Forester. This issue came up in the spring. The fire department contacted us about trimming trees over streets for one of their vehicles, which would be the large ladder truck, and they were having some issues with damage being caused to the vehicles by tree limbs that were too low. Current code stated that streets with truck traffic be cleared to a height of 13 feet, which is pretty standard for most trucks. Their equipment is a total of 15 feet. And so they had requested that we go above and beyond and trim to 15 feet to accommodate this vehicle. They had pointed out a number of streets in Eastport where they were requesting this work. So rather than continue to just kind of piecemeal it, we decided that maybe making that 13 a 15 would make more sense in the code if that's what their equipment requires, 15 feet.
Thank you. Does the committee have any questions?
Can't we just take air out of the truck's tires? I move we recommend approval if it's for the fire trucks. I don't think we have too much choice.
I think we have a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just curious on the implementation. Are you just gonna like mow through and clear them all at one time, or are you gonna be a little bit more strategic, or how does this work?
Our budget wouldn't allow for us to come through and just start elevating all the trees. So I think we'll be working with the fire department to address streets as they need them, where they find issues, and sort of go about it that way.
Yeah. Okay.
That is something to consider going forward, though. As you recall, our street tree trimming and maintenance budget was cut last year below what we had already requested, almost a $24,000 increase, which we did need for planting maintenance and other tree work, but it was not only not approved, it was actually cut below the previous year. So any street trees that are in the way, we cannot address proactively. So if the ladder truck runs into one, does further damage to it, again, I think that was what precipitated this request by the fire department, was that one of their trucks, I think it was the ladder truck, was knocking down trees, and it was actually damage was being caused. I think $800 worth of damage was done to one of the fire trucks. So we cannot do any proactive trimming, something to keep in mind when we go through the next budget cycle.
Let the record show the Finance Committee gave you your requested budget.
I did receive that, and I appreciate that very much.
Motion still on
There is a motion on the floor still.
Yes.
I second with the recommendation.
Okay, all those for favorable recommendation?
Aye.
Aye. All right, thank you. The next item is O2918, lease of Truxton Park to Kayak Annapolis, LLC. Is there any staff here to talk about that? Okay, thank you. And you can come on up too.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Alderman Ryan.
As I relayed to you this morning, the Finance Committee had a very detailed discussion of this legislation. We went into the contract itself, we went into the issue of, is this granting a monopoly, are there processes and so forth, and then we got into specifics about, is there actually room to accommodate this or other vendors at Truxton Park. I think we heard that that could be problematic. We heard that we would have to go through DNR for each approval. And the conclusion of the Finance Committee and our recommendation to the council at large is that we should approve this lease. There's another company that wants to find a location, and I will try to help them find a location someplace else. This is a service that is being provided by the private sector for our citizens through accommodation at Truxton Park, and it has been successful for 12 years. We couldn't see disrupting something that is both a service and a success, so we recommended approval to the council.
Okay. Thank you, Alderman, and I'm certainly in favor of simply piggybacking on the deliberation you had this morning. But I don't know if Alderwoman Tierney has any other questions, but I would like to hear as well from staff and from, I believe, can you state your name? And
Sure. My
who
name's
you're with?
Katie Vonderheide, and I'm owner-operator of Kayak Annapolis,
Thank you.
along with my husband, which is not here.
Well, if,
And then Ashley Leonard, Assistant City Attorney. I draft the lease and I work with the city and Kate to finalize it to the form that you were presented with. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's not a question. I just want the public to know, if they're watching and listening, that you are responsible in your lease for all of your trash and cleanup. And I know that that's very important to even the constituents on my side of the, creek, if you will. So.
Yeah, we do. We take it even further. We try to clean up even what we're not operating out of. We try to clean up the whole park as well,
And
whenever we can.
my understanding, this is an extension of a lease. That's important.
Well, it's essentially a new lease. They had a prior lease that
Right.
has expired. We're doing sort of a very temporary month-to-month until we can see if we get this lease approved. So yes, they've been there for about 12 years now, so yes.
And it's hilarious. It's absolutely. You ever seen? Oh, her husband is hilarious. Sorry. Okay. I digress.
so do either of you have any comments you'd like to have on the record?
I mean, no, I legally I'm comfortable with this lease. It's very similar to the prior lease. We've done some updates. I believe that the harbor master is actually going to suggest, but we'll do it formally, maybe adding a GIS map attachment to the lease just to make the exhibit a little bit more detailed, which I think is a good suggestion that came out of this morning's conversation. But it seems to be a successful working partnership there, and I think it's legally sound. So.
It's environmentally friendly.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. I will entertain a motion.
I did move
You did?
that
Okay.
we recommend favorably to the city council.
I second that recommendation.
All those in favor?
Aye?
Aye.
Ayes have it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See, this morning's time was worth it, right?
All right. Which one should we start with? I guess we'll start with O2718, Forest Conservation, no net loss. And first of all, I guess if I'd like to call forward staff, Office of Environmental Policy, Plan and Zoning, if you would be willing to come up to the table in case we have any questions. I guess I'll say a few things as the chief sponsor for this ordinance. This is something, the Forest Conservation Act was last updated in 2016 or early 17, I believe it was, and so it's been almost 2 years, I guess, year and a half since that's been implemented. But some of the things I want to ask Director Gutwald about are projects. So it seems like from looking at some of the reports that we submitted to DNR that there seems to be a need to adjust our forest conservation laws, and so that's the reason behind this ordinance. So I guess just to get things started, I guess for the record, can you all just state your name to the microphones?
Pete Gutwald, Director of Planning and Zoning.
Jackie Guile, Director of Office of Environmental Policy.
Brian Adams, Urban Forester.
Thank you. So Director Guile, can you just start and explain what the urban tree canopy goal is, or your designee,
Yeah.
whoever you'd like to.
Sure, since Brian monitors that program, I'll just let him describe it, because I think that most of your questions will be for Brian Adams.
Okay.
Sure. So our urban tree canopy goal came out of a program and started in 2005 and went into 2006 between the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, DNR, and then Mayor Ellen Moyer. Study was conducted to analyze how much tree coverage the city had, usually using aerial image analysis, and then it was grouped by land use, and they determined that it was about 41% of the city at that time. They looked at different scenarios for attaining a higher canopy cover for the many benefits that forests provide, and 50% was recommended. 50% was the lowest of the three scenarios, let's say, of potential that they saw for increasing our canopy in Annapolis. So 50% by the year 2036 is the goal that was established between the city and the Maryland DNR. Currently, we stand at somewhere between 43%, 45%. We don't know exactly. But we do know that, we plant trees, but we also take down trees that die, and, it's a constant cycle. And, in order to maintain that goal or meet that goal, we need to do something more than we're doing now to get that kind of an increase over time, see that kind of an increase.
And that goal is listed in the comprehensive plan?
It is. It's in the 2009 comprehensive plan under chapter 7 environment, and it is listed.
Okay. And so what section was it in under the environment?
It's chapter 7 environment.
Mm-hmm. All right. And let's see, can you explain just an overview of Forest Conservation Act, the purpose?
Sure. So the purpose and intent, I believe it was back in early 90s, was to preserve forests during the development process. The first step in a forest conservation plan is a delineation, which essentially maps out the characteristics of a forest stand, the health of species, identifies environmentally sensitive areas like steep slopes, streams, wetlands. Essentially gives you an idea of what you have there on that parcel or on that property. From there comes the a preliminary forest conservation plan, and that is where the developers are showing exactly how they plan to protect the priority forest that was identified in the stand delineation. So overall, it was a state law that was passed, I believe, in '91, and the idea was to preserve forest during the development process.
Thank you. And I'm going to jump back and forth a bit. Director Gutwald, so this is, as Mr. Adams said, it's in the comprehensive plan, but so it's listed as a goal in the comprehensive plan. What are the purposes of those goals and how?
It was set out as a policy recommendation, and then it identified has an action plan of things associated with that policy or that goal. I mean, it's interesting how typically when you have a comprehensive plan, you have a goal, then you have objectives, and then you have implementation strategies or policies. So I'd highlighted that as a policy statement, a recommendation, but it was captured in a policy that talked about protecting the environment and environmentally, I'm trying to remember what the exact policy, but it was the Chesapeake Bay, essentially associated with the Chesapeake Bay. And part of that is tree canopy. It lists out a number of different action strategies associated with trees and saving trees and preserving existing forests, but also maintaining the existing street trees and trees that are throughout the whole city. So that there are one action item that it talks about is strengthening 1709. Another action is talking about strengthening, tree conservation requirements. But there also talks about practices, action strategies that talk about practices associated with maintaining the existing tree canopy instead of losing it, not just to development, but through other types of practices. And so there's goals and there's implementation strategies. Those implementation strategies turn into either legislation, capital improvement programs, that putting money into different types of programs, establishing programs, education and outreach is how it's all implemented. So.
Okay. And Mr. Adams, I think you'd mentioned it'd be difficult to meet our goals, so what are the current trends in terms of you said you believe we're at 46%, but what of the, and Mr. Gutwald, you may have answers to this too, but what are the recent reports we've submitted to the DNR in terms of the Forest Conservation Act reports we submit about total acreage lost or cleared in the city? What do they show?
Yeah, so we've been reporting to the DNR since 2009 on any projects that trigger the FCA, their FCA projects, and it the goal or the trend is a loss in forest over time. From 2009 to 2017, there's been a loss of, I forget the exact number, but it's somewhere around 28 acres perhaps. I know that just last year, because I compiled that report, we had lost 1.7 acres of forest last year. So we haven't seen a gain or an improvement.
That's within the city limits?
I'm sorry, yes, within city limits, yep. Yep. And so, yeah, we haven't seen any increase in forest since we've been tracking this data. We've seen only a decrease.
Well, I guess the only increase would have been annexation from the original 2000, whatever it was, 5 report.
Right.
Tree canopy report. Yes, Alderman Terry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in this depreciation, I guess is the word, of forest, if we compare it to when the forest conservation legislation was enacted, has there been any improvement? I mean, that was the goal. Did it slow down, or what? Or were the developers doing a pay in lieu of that?
You're saying for the state?
Negated that.
For the state?
The city.
So the city.
I mean, in spite of the ordinance, we still are losing. I guess
Correct.
That's what I'm getting at.
And so I have the summary of the report, the FCA reports. It's 2009. through 2017 would be a net loss of 23.5 acres of forest.
Um,
And that is only considering projects that are subject to the Forest Conservation Act.
Which is an important point,
Yes,
Right,
because
that's what I'm trying to
three-quarters of this
get
city is
at.
in the critical area.
right.
Right, with the present Forest Conservation Act, so, yeah.
That's a good point. So the critical area, I guess we don't have
Has
numbers.
just as stringent laws, but we also have landscaping requirements and stormwater management requirements that includes planting of trees. So a true urban tree canopy, the last one I'm familiar that was done was 2014, and we were hitting the 44% mark. So to get to Alderman Tierney's question, it would be an interesting to see what, have we slowed the rate of how much forest we've been losing comparatively since we've been doing the Forest Conservation Act, or pick a date and time. And the second thing is, what are we including? Because as Brian said, this is only associated with forest conservation plans that have, so when you look at the critical area and their requirements in 1709 and that requirements, there's some strict requirements for tree planting going on throughout the city that we're not taking into consideration in the overall goal of how we're implementing the program, which is why I mentioned in the comprehensive plan, we talk about not just the Forest Conservation Act or critical area, which is, they put that under the tree requirement regulation, strengthening those, but other practices and things that we've been doing in the city that help slow the loss of, I'm not gonna say that we haven't lost tree canopy in the past however many years, but has slowed the rate in which we're losing it. So, I think the city has done, considerable efforts on that. So, just don't want to lose sight of that as what I bring up. So,
This is a stupid question. There still is the option of the developer to pay in lieu of, correct?
Yes.
Okay, is that, and then, so, how much has that derailed it, if you will?
we
If they-
rarely have accepted fee in lieu, particularly in the
yeah,
Forest Conservation Act. We've never accepted fee in lieu to date.
Okay,
We've required them to do it on site.
okay. Good
Critical
point.
area,
Yeah.
I'm experiencing, I think there's a couple of them, individual ones. 1709 we've taken fee in lieu of. That's the individual tree requirements, individual properties, less than 20,000 square feet, or less than 40,000 square feet, I guess. We've taken money in through that process, but in critical area, I think we've done that a couple of times. I couldn't tell you which projects, and we're looking at one right now that's looking at a hefty fee in lieu of right now.
Yeah,
So,
we do have a decent amount of money in that critical area fee in lieu fund, which
we're trying
is
to get creative
designated,
with.
right, designated to only within the 100-foot buffer, but we are meeting with the Critical Area Commission to find other
Yeah.
ways to spend that money on water quality enhancement projects and tree
Good.
plantings elsewhere.
Yeah, and Director Galwood, if you have any of the numbers for critical area, I'd love to see that, because that's certainly on my list to get to at some point. In terms of the forest, but I think the important point is that with the Forest Conservation Act projects, it's been a net loss of forest. And so, the intention of this ordinance is to adjust what's called the retention credit or reforestation credit. Can you explain how the retention credit, reforestation credit works? Mr. Adams or Mr. Gutwald, anybody who wants to volunteer?
You want me to go?
Go ahead.
So, what I would remind you also is the Forest Conservation Act does not eliminate the that you can't remove trees. You can remove trees as part of the program. So there's a threshold, there's a break-even point, and you go through your calculations about what you are allowed to remove per the law without mitigating, okay? So you get to a certain threshold and a break-even point of a total number of acreage that you can remove without mitigating the impacts to the forest. From there, you look at how much you're going to clear and then what you're going to replace. So there are reforestation requirements that once you've gone above the threshold or even the break-even point, you have to mitigate your impact, and it's at a 1-to-1 ratio in the city, which is the state only requires 1/4 of an acre to 1 acre to mitigate your impact. The credit comes in with the area that you're allowed to clear versus what you're going to clear. If you've been above that mark of that break-even point, you get credit for all those acreage of trees that you've gone above that break-even point in protecting and leaving as existing forest. This proposal eliminates that credit, so you don't get credit for the area that you weren't going to disturb in the first place. It brings it right back to the area that you're going to clear for your development process, and says you don't get credit for all this other stuff that you weren't going to impact anyways. You still have to replace if you go above the break-even point. So the break-even point is the area in which you're allowed to clear without having to have to do any mitigation. The credit's applied to that break-even point to an area that you're not disturbing at all. Does that basically explain it? As best I can in simple terms. Because if you want to see the worksheet and the formulas associated with it.
And so you mentioned that you've never had to accept a fee in lieu, because I guess for most projects, if not all, the developers have been able to do that on site. So nobody's had to actually mitigate off site. So it's essentially
I'm aware of.
So it's essentially untouched potential here in the city and for reforestation opportunities. Well, like you swing, I know you submitted, Mr. Adams submitted a staff report, talking about some of the reforestation options that are out there. But first of all, I think I guess you want to go into that, I'll follow up. But can you explain what you submitted?
So, following one of our previous meetings, some of the issues that were brought up by the Planning Commission was available space to plant. Where is it? Does it exist? How accessible? Where? Who owns it? So I prepared a preliminary report on that. I list it essentially by land use, but also by certain property owners like Anne Arundel County and the city of Annapolis. But essentially, it comes down to, I forget what the total, it was somewhere around 60 acres that I was able to conservatively estimate were available in the city. Now this was just using a combination of GIS. I did make some field visits. These are ranging from edges of ball fields on school property to agriculture fields to residential areas that are open. And then in addition to that is the opportunity to plant street trees. We did a conducted street tree inventory earlier in the year, and part of that was to identify ideal planting spaces that were open for new street trees. And we came up with over 600 spaces available. And I think there's more out there just to be discovered. Properties like St. John's has a lot of acreage, open acreage. The Maryland, I think it's the Maryland the district court property that's off of Rail Boulevard. They've got a huge open field right next to their parking lot. But there's areas like that in the city where there's certainly the potential, but the ability to actually plant trees on any of those properties is subject to approval by the property owner, obviously, and would involve easements agreements, et cetera, between the developer and the owner of the property.
Alderman Arnett?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, thank you for this report, and it was in response to some statements that were made that there was no place to plant trees. This says there are, but as you just said, it leaves open that the developer has to find those places, and then the developer has to get an easement in order to plant. And so it seems to me that there's work that we may still need to do. I'm not sure why there needs to be an easement. I assume there is a reason, but it feels to me that it is the city that has the goal. I subscribe to the goal. I think the tree canopy is an important part of not just preserving the bay, but our quality of life. But I guess I would ask, are there things that we can do either through legislation or through partnership with developers to make it easier to find these alternate sites?
So, I was discussing this morning with Brian about, what would be the next step to do with the summary that he's already created, and it would be a very low-cost solution. We think it's mostly just kind of grunt work, if you will, to go through our GIS map and the SDAT database and match up the parcels. So we've identified acreage by type of area: ag, commercial, county-owned, city-owned, but we haven't identified the exact parcels.
Right.
So what we would need to do is then, with the GIS overlay, is to identify those exact parcels, who owns them, street address, how many acres, and then how much of that parcel would be a potential planting site. So some of it would be Mr. Adams having to do that latter part, but we could have an intern do the rest of the work at very low cost. We estimated at $20 an hour, 50 hours, come up with $1,500 of an appropriation, and perhaps the developers want to kick that very small amount over to us so we could hire someone to do that work, and that therefore we would have more of a database to be provided to those who want to do a replanting.
So that's a good first step, but I don't think it addresses the real rub. And let me just give you a personal example. I had a huge holly tree in my backyard that, since I hate holly trees, fortunately it died. And
That's a native tree, by the way.
yeah, I know that, but it sticks your hands every time you're trying to do any gardening. So I could potentially have a place where a tree could be planted there. But I would be kind of loath to give the easement because it's fairly close to the back of my house. And suppose I or some future owner wants to expand the house. I would lose that ability. And I would be just skeptical of getting into all the legalities of providing an easement and that sort of thing. So my first question is, why do we have to have an easement? And are there things that we can do to be a good partner in this goal of 50% to make it easier for the developers to not only be directed to spaces, but be able to effectively utilize them? There's no real incentive for them to go around beating the bushes for these places and then get into all of the hassles of getting the easement and that sort of thing. And it's my view that anytime we can make it easier for the developers to meet the code, we all come out a winner. So I guess I would ask for some thinking that would allow us to say, yes, there are places you can plant, and yes, we've taken some extra steps to make it a lot easier for you to do that to meet these requirements.
I'll start. Why an easement? And I'll just start with there. 'Cause
Yeah.
when you do a forest conservation plan, what's recorded on the plan and in the court records is the forest conservation area. So it's delineated in perpetuity. Nobody can go in there. There's only certain types of activities that can go on in there. So no development activity, but if you needed to maintain the forest or whatever the case may be, there are certain activities.
So that's on the site itself.
That's on the site itself when you're dealing with a development. If you're gonna do off-site mitigation, how do I protect that forest from somebody going into your backyard and not cutting down that tree and I don't know anything about it?
Especially
Or
if
that
it's
it's
a hollow.
part of a requirement for a forest I can give you examples with parking if you want one. About people have delineated a specific area for their parking, and it's associated with a plan and a project that was approved over here. Same thing with trees. These trees are associated with mitigating their impact over here. I need some, whether it's, I don't care what you call it, I need some legal instrument that's recorded in the land records that say this is protected in perpetuity because it's meeting this property over here's requirements.
Right.
If it's a process in where the city owns the property and it becomes a bank, that's a viable option. They can start planting trees or, putting trees in conservation easements or whatever the case may be for a bank, but it needs to be some legal instrument that protects it for in perpetuity. That's why the easement.
No, I get all of that, but I guess I'm worried about setting laudable goals that are de facto or in reality unattainable. And I'm worried about setting goals for developers that we know they're not going to be able to attain. So what I'm looking for, and maybe we're never going to be able to find it, but I'm looking for an extra step on our part that basically makes it there's no excuse for you not to do this. We've changed the code, we've eased the burden, or we've assumed part of the burden, or whatever it is that makes it very hard not to do what the law asks that be done. So we've identified via GIS a number of locations. They're different kinds, they're different sizes, those sorts of things. Is there a way that we can, in some way, either get out of this having to get a legal easement and just allow the trees to be planted there, and we take our chances? Or I'm not suggesting that, but I'm just saying there's got to be some kind of workaround so that we don't set a goal that is unattainable, and I think thereby look kind of foolish.
Two things you have to remember. There's regulatory measures, and those are requirements, and then there are policy statements and goals that are established. As I said at the beginning of this, in answering Alderman Savage's question, is that there are a multitude of ways of achieving that goal. It's not just through the regulatory process. And the other thing that I did mention in terms of this urban tree canopy is some things we need to look at is that there are landscaping requirements and stormwater management requirements. Central Park is a good example of their forest concert. They were afforestation. They actually didn't have a reforestation requirement.
Means they're
They had an
adding
afforestation.
forest.
They're adding forest. But on top of that, only a portion of what they're planting is associated with their afforestation requirement. They're actually adding an acre, almost an acre of trees. They're only taking credit for their afforestation requirements of like 0.36 acres. But because of stormwater management and landscaping requirements, they're actually adding like 0.86 acres of trees. So it's just an example to give you of other ways of achieving the goal, not just through the regulatory process. It's one step though. I think, it's one way of strengthening your rules and regulations to achieve that goal. But it's not the only strategy, and no comprehensive plan should put all their eggs in one basket.
Right.
And I don't think the city of Annapolis did that. And that, I guess, is getting to your question of why there's an easement, or is there another way around it? The other way around achieving that goal is through other processes and programs. You got to keep that in mind when you're talking about a goal. It's not just the regulatory process. If you look at the comprehensive plan, it says that we were handing out, in 2009, we were handing out 500 trees through Tree America.
Arbor Day Foundation.
Whatever it was, we're a Tree City America award. It said with a goal of meeting 1,000, handing out 1,000 trees. Multiply that by 10, divide that by what, 100 square feet per tree? Ballpark? That's 22 acres we should have reforested since 2009.
Oh, we didn't.
No,
I
it's
don't know if we
difficult.
did.
No, often most of those trees don't end up in the ground or planted correctly. That's another problem with them.
Right. All right.
Yeah.
well,
Just a
I-
strategy
and
identified how to meet the goal.
I made my point. I want us to be good partners
Right.
as
Yeah.
policymakers and think about ways that we can make this so that it's a win for everybody, or at least it's easier to get to the goal. And that's all. I
So
have
to
say.
address your point, Alderman Allnet, about the Wyatt easement, well, under the state law, it's supposed to be in perpetuity, that the trees you replant, so we don't really have much of a choice there if you're doing it per the Forest Conservation Act. And also, you would not, you'd have to plant the trees in a reasonable fashion if you were doing it on private property. Of course, you wouldn't want to build it right up against a house where you take out the ability to put in a patio, or, build an addition, as you point out. Of course, there's setbacks, from the sides, the rear, the front of the house. Those are areas you can plant trees in, so that would be a logical area to put a tree in. We do have a model easement we do use through the Office of Law. That could be provided. We would need to look at it again, make sure it met all our criteria for this program, but that's something we could provide to builders. They wouldn't have to come up with their own easement. Of course, they'd want to run it through their own attorney, but we do have a model easement.
All right. Thank you.
Just say something quick. I think we have to look at why we're trying to protect the forest in the first place, and that's to improve water quality. So if we allow them to clear the forest in 10, 20, even 30 years, it kind of goes against that effort. I know the county, I believe, tried to get DNR to relax on that, and it was no traction in that regard. I mean, it's really, the conservation easements are just central to our whole industry, I guess, for lack of a better word, for conservation easements, and all the easements that the Conservancy Board holds, for example, is just that, and they also, homeowners often get tax breaks resulting from those conservation easements. And I do want to just say that I think there are certainly some things that the city can do. Maybe have a program where we find homeowners who have backyards and would want to welcome trees to increase the canopy. But also I think in terms of our public land, parkland, we can help try to facilitate that and allow those to get reforested. But I do kind of believe that it comes down to the developers in terms of, especially if you're talking about going on private property to find reforestation potential, because they actually have to go and work out some kind of incentive or financial deal with those homeowners to convince them to put the easements on their property. That's why the county freed up some of their fee and lieu money to be given, I think it was like $5,000, a couple $1,000 they used to incentivize the creation of conservation easements, and that if we collected the fee, we could do that, but we haven't actually had anybody who's had to pay into our fee and lieu because they've taken advantage of this credit. But I do want to just...
Well, let me just respond to that. I think what Brian has done is a good start. I think what Jackie suggested, where we go further and use the GIS to identify specific parcels, at least makes it easier for a developer to look at where there's some likely targets. You don't have to start with a blank slate and try to go figure it out. I just hope there's more we can do to help them do what they need to do according to the law, and that would be a good thing.
Alderwoman Tierney?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, let me preface this by saying I think that this is obviously very important. I know my husband isn't watching, so I can say this. We did hit a deer the other night, of all places, on Route 2 on the way to Target, where that gigantic development is. Like, a deer ran out of this little median. So, I mean, you talk about, it affects wildlife. It's, so the merit is unbelievable. But walk me through here. I'm trying to, I know I have a construction background, so I'm kind of making the analogy is like what we do with like dirt, when we do off-site dirt, and there's this agreed area where we can stockpile and it's off-site. The key word here is off-site mitigation. And theoretically, it sounds doable that we have, number one, we have these locations, but I don't know how it will work. I don't know how, does the developer have a contract with the city then, and to say, okay, I'm gonna plant in this designated area, and then in this designated area, who is then responsible for the maintenance of that area? And that kind of stuff, we have to figure this out, how this would really work, and the best way would be to have designated stockpile areas, if you will, like the bigger the better, like, hey, we have this area of planting, instead of these piecemeal. I mean, I just can't see a big development saying, I mean, let's think real life here. What development are we looking at now? Say, where there's a lot of reforestation that's needed, and they're at a net loss, so they have to make it up, and it could be up to like 10 different locations. So I mean, the hardship issue, I'm just looking at practicality and maintenance and the contract with the city and where we are in all of this. Is this been thought out
I just want to address
somewhere else?
Yeah, one part of what you're saying is that Pete and I have talked about what sites there are in the pipeline,
Yeah.
as well as what we've looked at, what's the open land for redevelopment.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
really, there are no large parcels left in the city to develop on, even where Forest Conservation Act would come into play. You need about an acre of property, and we don't have a lot of acre lots left in the city to develop. So we're looking at much smaller parcels, and so the mitigation is a bit easier because we have roughly 60 acres plus 600 planting sites so far that we've identified. So it's a bit more practical than it might appear at first blush, because where we're talking about where you have to mitigate are smaller in scope.
So then walk me through the process then. So a developer so the developer would have a contract with the city?
And how do you do it, Pete?
No.
Yeah, how would we do it?
No, they would have to identify, through the plan and development review process, they would have to identify what their off-site mitigation would be. They would have to, and it would be part of their condition of approval. They would have to put an easement on that property, to make sure that that's designated as the forest conservation area for this development, so we would count that. And then they would either plant the trees, or if, let's say it's a bank, it's already forested, they would include that as part of their forest conservation requirements. And the maintenance would probably end up, well, the way it works right now, the maintenance ends up as part of the homeowners association or whoever takes over the development. So it becomes, if it's a residential development or the business development, it would become their responsibility to maintain it.
On an off-site?
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was 5 years the developer had to
Yeah, that's correct.
maintain it,
Well,
and
I'm
then
just talking
after
about in
that, it falls-
perpetuity. It ultimately ends up being the responsibility of,
Yeah, the
Yeah,
city or the
the
homeowner.
way the law reads now is, so if it's off-site mitigation, the developer is responsible for maintenance for the first 5 years
Right.
of that site.
particularly if they're planting, the survivability.
Right.
They have to maintain a certain percentage of survivability over the first handful of years. But I'm talking about long-term. Let's say it's a forest already, so.
Are we providing a list, an inventory of areas that we know we can get an easement on, or?
Currently, no. What we say is, if you want to do off-site mitigation, you need to find the property, give me the easement and the agreement. What we're suggesting, what Brian has done is identified, since the issue is I
Yeah.
can't find anything, Brian's gone through and done
Right.
some analysis and said, here are potential sites. I think the next step is, okay, who's the willing participant? Because the next answer is, I can't, yeah, you found all these sites that have land available for planting of trees, but are they willing to be individual? I mean, I just go through one perfect example. We went to David Gerald for his property at the water treatment plant and said they want to put trees over here, and he said sure, and I said, well, okay, let's put we need to put an easement, and he was, okay, never mind, because he wasn't going to risk, the potential expansion of whatever he had to do at his treatment plant in perpetuity. But he was okay for the trees for the next handful of years, but that wasn't going to meet the requirements of Forest Conservation Act. So, sorry, Dave.
Thank you, yeah.
And just to touch upon the conservation easement part of it one more time, is if I've heard suggestions, could we do this for 20 years? Could it be a 40-year? There's really no point in doing that if we're trying. It's just punting the problem down the road to the people 40 years hence. So, and if you're going to do this, you should do it right from the beginning.
Okay. Any other questions? So the way this code, the ordinance is currently written, it would catch about, I believe, 5 projects. It was 4 projects. Oh, that's right, yeah. And I know Tyler Heights has been completed already, approved. But how much acreage of forest are we talking about? Trying to catch?
Well, I had the net loss is what I had. It's somewhere for about 24, 25 acres would be the net loss between those 4 projects.
If we couldn't get this passed.
I'm including Central Park as an attic, so,
Right, yeah, that makes sense. Okay. So that kind of just shows my colleagues, I think, some of the urgency behind trying to get this passed is 23 acres is approximately what percentage of our tree canopy?
23 acres, it's
Yeah.
somewhere 1 to 1.5%.
Okay, so it's a sizable amount. So,
I should preface, that's on the plans, as they were submitted. All 3 of these plans, 2 of the plans have gone through a revision, so
okay,
it could
yeah,
change, just to.
right. All right, and Mr. Gold, while we have you here, we received a letter from DNR.
Yes.
Do you want to explain to my colleagues what that's?
I did respond to that, by the way.
Okay.
So we sent the proposal to DNR, Darren Honestly. She responded in that she was concerned with how certain things were going to be.
Your
explain
mic,
how
Pete,
process-
your mic isn't on.
I'm sorry. She basically had a concern over how is this going to be more stringent than the state law because she felt that the credit was giving credit, was more valuable to the existing forest that was there. So how does that maintain or protect existing forest that is currently on the properties? She was concerned about how certain things would work with the worksheet and what calculations would be taken into consideration. I did respond that we have a number of different items that we've done in the past that had strengthened our code above the state's code. I understood her concern about protecting existing forest, but I felt that the increase in our threshold levels from the last changes to the code, because our threshold levels are higher, the amount that you can clear or keep, that you have to retain before anything else occurs on the property. We've increased those. Our fee in lieu is much more stringent. It's $10 a square foot, where many are cents on the dollar. We also changed the reforestation requirements from 1/4 to 1 to 1 to 1. So those coupled with removing the credit would be strengthening the city's code much greater than what the state requires. I just drafted that letter. I meant to bring copies for you all today. I'll email them later this afternoon or tomorrow morning. But basically explained, and then I told her that the worksheet would change. Our forest conservation manual, or our code, refers to the state's forest conservation manual, and the worksheet in the forest conservation manual is what we utilize. So the worksheet doesn't change except for the values that we are associated with in terms of the threshold level based on land use type and the reforestation requirements from 1/4 to 1 to 1. And then beyond that is the credit, and that would get removed. The credit line would get removed. And that's how I told her the worksheet would work. So that was my response. And to her concerns, she just wanted some explanations of how this was going to meet the state requirements, essentially.
So she didn't raise any objection yet, per se, anyway?
No,
Okay.
those were just questions, so.
Okay. Any other questions for staff?
Yeah, so that's a good point, though. So that's a really interesting point. So she's saying that the impetus in having a credit on what you're not going to touch, she feels is stronger, versus what we're saying is the impetus in reforesting what you have cleared is a stronger initiative. I mean,
Well, what I also explained her, no, I think what her point was is that one of the primary goals is to protect existing forest
Right.
rather than replanting it,
Right,
whips and small caliber trees. So the idea is to protect that. And I also did explain in my letter, through our development review process, we go to great lengths of protecting the priority forest areas before we allow any reforestation to occur or
bingo,
any
bingo, okay,
clearing to
so you do,
occur.
okay.
So I did explain that
Otherwise-
to her as well.
right.
Our first priority is maintaining the mature canopy, the more,
Okay,
the priority
that's great to
forest
hear.
on the site.
Yeah, that's great to hear, because otherwise, they're looking at this
That was a good
canvas.
question, 'cause I forgot that
Yeah, and saying, what do I care if I shave it, you know, sorry, they're developers out there.
Well-
No worries. But, yeah, that's good, that it's looked at that way.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
also important to consider, like Pete said, we have other provisions that have been strengthened, be it the fee in lieu, the conservation threshold raised. So those create arguably more of an incentive to protect established forests, because you're creating a
Yeah.
much higher economic value, which is now
Yeah.
$400,000 per acre for the fee in lieu.
Right.
As to previously, it was
Yeah.
only about
I mean, that's,
$10,000
the
per
goal
acre.
is to not disturb the in situ material, you know, when you,
Right.
so, yeah, okay.
Any other questions for staff? All right, thank you very much. Micah called again, but thanks for coming. I'd like to call forward representatives from the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, I think, are they here? Ms. Lutz, and Environmental Commission, and South River Federation. Mr. Murphy, are you here with the commission? Yes, sir. You can come on up too. Or whoever else is from the Environmental Commission, you're welcome to come on up. So if you could just state your name, organization for the record.
Hi, Elaine Lutz, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation.
Jesse Eilert, South River Federation.
Make sure their mics are on.
The gentleman from the Environmental Commission, can you make sure your mic is on and give your names and addresses for the record, please?
Paul Murphy, 105 Northwest Street.
Michael Giblin, 5 Park Place.
Thank you very much. I want to just start with Ms. Lutz. Can you explain what your experience, background is with the Forest Conservation Act?
Sure, absolutely. We have Chesapeake Bay Foundation has been reviewing the Forest Conservation Act.
Your mic, Elaine, your mic, breathe.
Oh, okay. Chesapeake Bay Foundation has been reviewing the Forest Conservation Act, functioning in a large number of urban and rural counties over the past 5 or 6 years after it came to our attention that some of the jurisdictions weren't conducting a program appropriately. So we've been working on analysis of the law, both as it's written and then in how it's functioning across various size and urbanized jurisdictions, and have spent the last couple of years talking to the General Assembly about ways to improve the outcomes of the Act in response to some of the problems we've seen in the Act not obtaining its goals, its stated goals, and having some of those same conversations that the city has been having. So we have reviewed forest conservation plans, fee in lieu programs, banking programs, various code provisions as local jurisdictions tweak their codes, and have a pretty good overall view of what's happening in various jurisdictions around the state now. So
Great.
pretty extensive review.
Okay, and so in your experience, I think in your testimony you mentioned, the fee in lieu was brought up by some others this afternoon. But so in your experience, I think you mentioned Rockville had a higher than the
Yes.
state minimum in terms of the fee in lieu.
Yeah.
What was that?
So what we were seeing with the fee in lieu is that the city of Rockville, before recent changes to the Annapolis City Code, did have the highest fee in lieu amount at $5 a square foot. The surrounding jurisdiction of Montgomery has $1.20 per square foot. Various jurisdictions like Prince George's County have 90 cents per square foot. Let's see, yeah, Montgomery County is one. So it ranges everywhere from the state minimum of 30 cents per square foot all the way up to Annapolis's $10 per square foot, with the median ranges being anywhere from $1 to $5 to then, of course, the $10. What we've seen in the jurisdictions that have increased their fee in lieu, like Prince George's County has a 90-cent fee in lieu. They've done a couple of things to make that functional, which we've seen across the state, that fee in lieu programs aren't functioning as intended because the money often isn't sufficient to replace the trees that the money is being put up for. So in Prince George's County, they have restricted the acceptance of fee in lieu money to mitigation under an acre. So if you have a small project and you only have an acre of mitigation, they'll accept fee in lieu. But if you have more mitigation, they will require you to do your own mitigation. That has helped them incentivize forest mitigation banking, which is commonly recognized both in the code and from an ecological perspective as being preferable, because it does create a larger, more contiguous area of forest. There are a number of jurisdictions that don't do fee in lieu at all. Carroll County, Dorchester County, and Harper County did away with fee in lieu programs entirely, and they put the burden entirely on the developer to go out, locate land, and do mitigation, or avoid clearing that forest in the first place if they can't find the appropriate mitigation. And those programs have been operating like that very well for at least the past 10 years, I would say, in most of those counties, 5 or 10 years. So again, it just puts the obligation on the developer to, if you can't find mitigation for your project, you need to go back to the drawing board and redesign or cut less forest or find out how to replant on site. And well, development certainly hasn't stopped in those areas, so that seems to be working well, and they have no problem with that. So really, it's fee in lieu is a matter of each jurisdiction looking at their needs and figuring out what incentives, disincentives, tweaks to the program work best for them. Like I said, Rockville, jurisdiction with very little area left, decided to go with $5 per square foot because that was the appropriate incentive or disincentive, however you want to put it, for them to get the outcome they wanted of avoiding fee in lieu by using other mitigation methods.
So it forces them into, like you just said, into the other mitigation options. And so what are those other mitigation options you mentioned? You mentioned mitigation banking, but what are the other? Because they're not limited to just reforestation, right? They have other things.
Right. There's a hierarchy in the state code that says selective clearing and minimizing your footprint and minimizing your initial impact is the #1 priority, obviously. Then you seek to do on-site planning. After your development is done, you fill back in forest and open space as much as you can. Then you can move to off-site mitigation, and you're supposed to look first at sensitive areas like steep slopes, streams, wetlands, habitat areas, adding to existing forests to ameliorate some of those edge effects, fragmentation effects, creating hubs and corridors between existing forests. So those are off-site priorities. And then if you can't find any off-site, you're supposed to turn to forest mitigation banking. And then as a very last resort, once you've proven that none of those options are available, it's only supposed to be a matter of last resort that you go to fee in lieu. And, whether or not that is happening in reality varies by jurisdiction, but we've seen in large part it doesn't, because the fee in lieus are too low to make it worth the effort to do any of the things that the law does prioritize and require to be done first.
Alderman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So it has deemed successful in what counties were they? The off-site mitigation, where the onus is on the developer to find the land, and if he can't develop, basically, is what? So what counties were those?
That's been Carroll County, Harper County, and Dorchester County currently have no fee in lieu at all.
Yeah.
And then a number of others have raised it well beyond the state minimum because they find that to be the proper incentive to direct mitigation to those other options first.
Okay. Okay.
Also in jurisdictions like Annapolis that have urban tree canopy goals and are in a municipality, street trees and certain landscaping is also acceptable. It's also allowed and is preferred, again, over fee in lieu, which is last resort.
That's what I'm thinking, again, real life is, if we, I mean, I look at Clay Street, for example, it doesn't have one frickin' tree on the
Yeah.
street, not one. And so how would you know, how would this work? I mean, so the city has to sort of facilitate in something like that, you know? I'm just trying to optimize the implementation.
Well, in those things, in areas without fee and lieu, like in Hartford County, they have, fairly advanced GIS system. When they're going through the initial development review and negotiation between the county and the developer, as you all know, there's many steps of development review. You come with a
Yeah.
concept, you negotiate,
Right.
you say maybe move this, you say maybe do that. At that time of initial site plan development, the county sits down with the developer and
Absolutely.
says, okay, you want to remove this much forest, you're going to have this much mitigation. Where is it going to go? They pull up the screen, they talk
Boom.
about
That's-
opportunity areas, they negotiate it. If the developer doesn't have somewhere to go, the county says you're going to need to redesign this. You're going to need to have less impact until you can come up with how you're going to appropriately offset that impact.
Okay, okay.
Did have another question. Did you, anything in your experience, anything you wanted to add in terms of the importance of conservation easements as a practice?
Well, the conservation easements are required by state law. That is something that a number of jurisdictions have talked about trying to get around or asked for exemptions from that portion of the state law. But the General Assembly has repeatedly said, no, that doesn't make sense to, spend this time and money on planting a tree that is going to take decades to get to maturity and function as well as the trees that were removed, just to be at risk of being cleared in 10 or 20 years when it finally reaches maturity. That just doesn't make sense. We're not actually offsetting then, we're just kind of moving it around temporarily. So the permanent easements, I recognize, have been a point of contention, but I don't see another way to recoup the ecological benefits of that forest mitigation. You wouldn't be mitigating it then. You would ultimately continue to lose that forest if it wasn't protected.
Any other questions for Sluts? All right, thank you. Mr. Iliff, state who you're with and background.
Yeah, hi, Jesse Iliff. I'm South River Keeper. I work with South River Federation in Edgewater. We're in support of the no net loss ordinance because as a watershed organization that has a lot of watershed in the city, we feel that it's important to retain forest coverage for its water filtration benefits. There are 4 creeks that have watersheds in the city and feed into the South River, and I second most of what Ms. Letch just mentioned, but wanted to also add that obviously City of Annapolis, part of Anne Arundel County, and Anne Arundel County has in 2017 had the highest percentage of major development applications of any county in the state, representing 11% of all development applications over an acre, even though it's only 3% of the state's area. And so given that tremendous development pressure, we think that it's vitally important to make sure that any impacts to forests are mitigated as strongly as possible to preserve their water quality benefits. I'm happy to answer any other questions, but that's what I'm coming from as a watershed advocate.
Any questions for Mr. Iliff?
Nope.
Thank you, Mr. Iliff.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah, and Environmental Commission, thank you for attending. You're welcome to make a few remarks if you'd like. I also have a few specific questions. Because I believe the commission has also put together some information about reforestation, areas for potential reforestation. Is that correct?
Correct. And we defer to the good work, or correct, we've done some work, the city and Brian identifying that map, which we have colored copies if you haven't seen them already. We think that's an excellent map or starting point for all involved. So we, the Environmental Commission, are in favor of the no net loss. We have a number of experts who have spoken upon this. And I think are you in receipt of the AEC letter? I believe it's been emailed to you. You want to pass a few to the, those to the front, and these can go to the crowd in the back. So in addition to what you've heard from the experts on how much stormwater trees absorb, that we have more intense storms than we used to, we need many remedies to reduce the loss. And it's interesting that the city is still losing. It's good the city's losing tree canopy at a slower rate. I mean, I know that residents in AEC, South River, CBF have been active on trying to push more, preserving more trees, or and it may have been some changes to the overall economics development, but let's recognize it seems like we're still losing tree canopy. We're just losing less rapidly. So I think it's good that we're losing less rapidly, but I think further corrective measures are needed, particularly as we have stronger rainstorms. The record in Annapolis now is 6 inches in one day, 2.7 inches in an hour. So we're not totally against development, but you know, what we knew about rainfall and climate 15 years ago has changed, and either we can keep up or we don't. As I've said before, as a small business person, I'm for a healthy economic landscape in Annapolis, but we also just don't want to see privatize the gains and socialize the losses. The taxpayers, we have approximately $20 million over the next 20 years to remedy our stormwater, and if we don't do a little bit more pay-as-you-go and just externalize cost, it's coming back to the taxpayers. So we want to retain more trees, and being sensitive or aware of developers' challenges and going through, there are a couple things I would say. A lot of these rules have been written by the city, and some of this is stormwater, some is trees, but it all ties together, right? Some of these policies were really originally written by the state, the policy wonks, back in 91 and 92. We're a quarter of a century later. We're 25 years later after the wonks started writing this code, and a little bit due to citizens and some strong people in the AEC, our city in 2016 put this together. It's not that we're changing rules in midstream. You know, it's 25 years to recognize this and add the climate change, or at least more intense rainfalls. We've got a quarter of a century realizing we need to change our course a little bit. So I don't think we're changing rules in midstream or the drop of the hat. We're sensitive to projects in the pipeline, but when Crystal Springs has been in the pipeline for maybe, could be off by a little bit here, but more than a decade, 12 years, at what point does a pipeline just turn into a warehouse, okay? So, so we need to come up, good people working on both sides need to figure out what's viable on this, and the state law has always been, I believe the term is last vested, late vesting. Those are the things. We're not against development. We just want to see it done a little bit more responsibly, since we're losing tree canopy and many parts of the water quality are diminishing.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. Would you like to make any brief remarks?
Well, I was gonna mostly focus on the stormwater side, but as you heard, the two subjects are actually interrelated.
Is this related to the no net loss or the stormwater resolution?
Well,
Or just stormwater in terms of forests?
I thought I'd wait till the stormwater
Okay.
resolution came up, but.
Yeah, that's fine.
But I do wanna just reemphasize what Paul said, that
Okay.
the two are intrinsically related.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Any questions for any of the folks at the table? All right, well, thank you, everybody, for your time.
Thank you.
I'd like to open up the floor to anybody else from the public who may like to make a few remarks. Mr. Hyatt, come on down. Hmm? Thank you. I think it's over.
Good afternoon, Mr. Savage. Alan Hyatt, 200 Westgate Circle. I'm here on behalf of a number of clients. You know, I think there's something that can be done to create some legislation that all parties can live with. And, you know, I would urge you to consider some balancing with this particular legislation. I think there's a need to have some opportunity to plant trees off-site. There's not always the opportunity to reforest on-site, particularly in I use this example when I spoke to the city council. If you have a fully forested site and you clear it, then you can't reforest on the site. And I don't mean clearing the entire site. I used an example. If you have a 10-acre site and you clear 3 acres, under this legislation, you have to reforest 3 acres, right? So you can't do it on the site that you're only clearing 30% of. And the reality is, I mean, this is very nice that Mr. Adams did this. I mean, it's a start. But the reality is there's no place to reforest in the city of Annapolis. We've been through it on numerous occasions. Mr. Gutwald referred to it. We have tried to reforest in Truxton Park. We have tried to reforest in the Back Creek Park. We have tried to reforest at the waterworks. We have spoken to churches. We have spoken to the housing authority. You know, just because you identify potential land that can be reforested does not mean that the owner of the property, and in some cases the city is the owner of the property, will consent to the planting of the trees. And the biggest bugaboo is the perpetual easement. It's not realistic. Now, street trees, maybe the city has control over, and perhaps there's an opportunity to give larger credit for the street trees in certain instances, because you know it's not reasonable. I mean, you can't just say, all right, sorry, you're not going to be able to develop your land. It's private property. You do have some rights. If you can't find a place to reforest, and then you go down to the, you know, least desirable alternative, and that's payment in lieu, and we have the highest in the state by a long shot. $10 a square foot is punitive. I don't know how else to describe it. And you know, it struck me, one of the speakers at the last city council meeting said, well, it's not a lot of money. You know, developers can build 25 townhouse units to the acre. Well, that's not true. That is not true. You can build about 8, maybe 9 townhouses to the acre. You can't build 25. If you could build 25 townhouses to the acre, well, first of all, zoning doesn't even allow it. R3 zoning allows up to 12 to the acre. So, you know, part and parcel to this, I think there's got to be some adjustment to the fee. There has to be some opportunity to reforest. You know, I had the opportunity to sit down with Gerald Weingrad, who spent a lot of time in this subject. Monday we talked about the village at Providence Point, but which, by the way, for Mr. Murphy's sake, the Crystal Spring is dead. There's no such thing as Crystal Spring. That concept is gone. But for the last couple of years, we have the village at Providence Point in the pipeline. And that's kind of an interesting proposition, because there's probably no property like that in the city of Annapolis. It's 180 acres, substantially forested, and unlike Crystal Spring, this has been now shrunk to about, give or take 30-some acres. It's only going to be a continuing care retirement community, and the vast bulk of that site is going to be devoted to a combination of a conservation easement and a forest conservation easement. But if this bill passes, to mitigate, one for one, I don't know where we can do it. And there's a chunk that can be done on site, but if we have to go off site with 12 or so acres, I don't know where we would do it. And we've already made it very aggressive, changing that replacement of a quarter acre to 1 acre. That when we go beyond the threshold, that was the last change to the city's Forest Conservation Act. That's pretty aggressive, and that really hasn't even been tested yet. I don't think there's been any projects. And this whole concept of changing the rules, well, for the several projects that are in the pipeline is lengthy in the city of Annapolis. You do not start a project and finish it within 6 months. It's 2-3 years, and lots of expenditure is made to change the rules for those particular projects. That's not right. That is not right. Oftentimes, hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions, have been spent. And I understand there's a need to retain or to achieve a 50% canopy. There's ways to get there, I suspect, but I think and I'm not arguing about vesting. I know we're a late vesting state. Nobody has to give us the law. We know about that, but I don't think it's fair, for lack of a better term, when you have a project that's been in the pipeline, designed and pretty much ready to go, and then you say, oh, sorry, this isn't going to work for you. I mean, what's the reaction of the business community? And you know what? I think you should be concerned about that. This is not, there are goals in the comprehensive plan for environmental matters, but there are also goals in the comprehensive plan for land use matters and for economic matters. And one probably shouldn't be more important than the other. There needs to be some type of a balance. So what I'm urging you to do is, let's look at this. There may be some way to amend this. There may be some way to impose perhaps some stricter requirement on the few projects in the pipeline, but maybe not the full load. I'm willing to try to come up with some language, try to come up with some ideas on amendments. If you're willing to be flexible and willing to listen, I'll work on it. We had a pretty good meeting, I thought, yesterday with Jackie and David and Pete and some of the local civil engineers. I mean, there's practical things that are going on. You don't want no development in the city, and you want to see redevelopment. And if it's too onerous, one of the engineers said, if it's too onerous, I have people come in all the time about redevelopment, which would where we have no stormwater management being practiced on sites, and if it's too onerous, they're just not going to do it. They will not do it, and then they end up painting the building and resurfacing the parking lot, and I think he described it as lipstick on a pig, and we don't end up with good projects. So I'm 100% in favor of good projects. I would like to see us achieve the 50% canopy, but I think this is a little bit too harsh without having some assistance. That's all I'm saying.
Thank you, Mr. Hyatt. Any questions for Alderman Arnett?
Yes, so I'd like to go back to your 3-acre example.
Yep.
That's totally forested.
Yep.
I think the intent of the state law and this legislation is that parcel not be developed. I know we're going to hear arguments about taking and those sorts of things, but as we heard earlier, we're losing in the battle to get tree canopy, and we're losing the forest, and when you have a parcel that is 100% forested, I really don't think we want that to be developed, and I think that that's the state law, and it's certainly.
Well, it's not the state law. It is, no, the state law is not, is.
The Forest Conservation Act is to preserve forests. And if you have a totally forested parcel, I think that the ideal is to not develop that and then plant new trees someplace else. Is to leave it forested.
Right, but the state law doesn't prohibit you and doesn't even
Right,
address.
but what I'm saying is, in an environment where we continue to lose canopy,
Yeah.
and where there are other alternatives to develop, I think that it's preferable that that fully forested land not be disturbed.
Well, then that is a taking. I mean,
Well,
that's a whole different
then-
ballgame.
Yeah.
That's not right. I mean, you can't, if there's no place to mitigate and there's no opportunity to pay a fee that's not punitive,
So,
what do you
okay.
do?
So it is, and you heard me speak earlier, it is finding ways that we can make mitigation more possible.
Yeah.
And I do believe the city has to be a stronger partner in that. I have in brackets, I'm struck, and I don't want to put Mr. Gerald on the hot seat like Mr. Gutwald did to him, but I'm struck that maybe the city needs to have a policy that the city will actively pursue making sites available. I'm thinking about, and I'm actually tortured by thinking about, the empty land behind the Eastport Fire Station, which in my mind's eye I'd kind of marked off as a potential place where we could do workforce housing. The city could try to get workforce housing built there. Since I don't think workforce housing is also not attractable to developers, it's not going to be as high a return as if you could put a nice big single-family $2 million home there. But perhaps, and I know the soccer players also wouldn't like this, but perhaps that is a location that the city can say, look, we're not using it, and it is a pretty big parcel, and it would be nice to have a forested area on city property. So I'm with you that we need to be a stronger partner, a better partner, when we're putting in more demanding code. We need to help pick up the slack.
It's got to work both ways.
Right.
I mean, what do you say about the fact that there's these opportunity areas? You know, you have in the city comprehensive plan,
Yeah.
you know, you have an opportunity area and it's wooded.
Right.
Which
Well, actually, I want to go back and look at that, because I don't have the sense. I think Eastport is the opportunity area. I don't think the four delineated.
But
in the
they've been
comp plan.
delineated, you know, it is on the
I know
plan,
that.
so, you know, it's
But I
just-
hope when we get redoing the comp plan, we're gonna go back and look at, what's happened in those areas and how effective it is setting that
So you
up.
want Eastport to be a
This-
no opportunity area?
the city has,
Yeah.
the city has plenty of money, let it condemn these properties and buy them and make them parks, you know?
Well, but I want to go on to the fee. I was on the committee that came up with the $10, and the $10 did kind of come out of thin air. We did want it to be intimidating, but if we cut that in half, so we went to the Rockville level, is that going to make a big difference?
It may, I don't know the answer to that. I would say on some of these smaller projects, it's certainly easier to swallow. I mean, my understanding is that it costs about 23,000 an acre to reforest. If you had a clear acre, that's the cost. You know, is it fair to say $200 and some thousand an acre? Seems a little bit much, you know, but $400 and some thousand off the charts. I mean, and it's the highest in the state. I mean, it kind of tells you that it's
Somebody's
off the
got to be
chart.
the highest.
I get it, right. Yeah. So, yeah, there's got to be.
But I'm serious. I mean,
Yeah.
so you're asking for balance. I hear
Yeah.
that request. And that is certainly a place where we can, I mean, it's not subject to the no net loss, but it is certainly subject to whole Forest Conservation Act.
Yep.
And that is something where, if we're trying to balance, I'd actually be interested in hearing from you or the clients that you represent, what would be something that it accomplishes the goal of being somewhat intimidating, but is also a show of good faith in terms of balancing it. And you don't have to answer now.
No, I understand that, and maybe it's some kind of a sliding scale, because, you know, if it's spread over 3 or 4 units, it's probably too much. If it's spread over 20 or 30 units, it may be okay.
Yeah.
And I think Providence Point, just to conclude, I mean, that may be, I mean, that is a special situation. There's nothing like that in the city.
Right.
Maybe there's some kind of special arrangement, grandfathering of some type, where they don't get away with exactly what's here today, but maybe not quite as burdensome as what's proposed, because that one, if you do have to replace 15 or 17 acres or whatever it is, you know, that's not possible in the city, but maybe they can do a healthy dose of street trees or something. I don't know. I
Okay.
just think it's, you know, just don't want to, it's like a lot of things, it's not that simple. There's some complexities here.
Go to Alderwoman
quick
Tierney.
question.
She has some questions.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you for being here. How's your dad?
He's okay, thank you.
Good.
Thank you for asking.
I've heard two conflicting, you testified that you looked at opportune areas and they weren't, there were problems, in the beginning of your testimony. I mean, that's what would be different now? I guess that's a city question. The
Yeah.
sites that you talked about, what were the obstacles? There were reforestation areas you cited that you couldn't get.
Right, well, we have, I have a project that is an Alderman Savage's award, actually, the Chesapeake Grove at Bemby Beach. That happens to be in the critical area, so it's a little bit different set of rules, but there needs to be some off-site mitigation, because it just doesn't
Right.
all fit on the site. And that's the one I'm talking about. We've been trying to find locations to plant trees in the city for a
Okay.
long time, and we can't find it. And these people, it costs them $1,200 a tree the fee in lieu in the critical area. It's $200 and some thousand. They don't want to spend $200 and some thousand. I mean, they can spread that over the townhouses if they have to, only because the same group owns that land from the days of Cars and Sparrows Beach. They bought it in the 40s. Otherwise, it would have been, they've told me more than once, man, we would have walked away if we were a contract purchaser, but they had the good fortune of owning that land since the 40s, but we can't find a place to plant. And we tried Truxton Park, Back Creek, Waterworks, and Housing Authority, and to no avail. So I just want everybody to be
Well, that's- I
realistic.
mean, that's a
It
little-
sounds good that
Well,
there's.
that's a little troubling. I mean, those
It
are
was
good
a lot
areas.
troubling, sure, yeah.
So in your meeting with the city yesterday, did you discuss that?
They know
or-
that, yep,
Yeah.
yep, we talked about that, and so, you know, this, as I say, this is a good start. It's a matter of reaching out to these people and say, hey,
Yeah.
you have 5 acres of industrial land,
Yeah.
can we plant an acre? And they might say, well, what are you gonna give me for it, or is there a tax
Yeah.
break I get out of it, or something, you know? I mean, I think
Well,
there needs to be a program that we develop, a mitigation bank. That would be important to try to
Well,
develop.
to my colleague's point, Alderman Arnett, and the Planning Commission's recommendations, they do suggest that the city is become a broker,
Right.
and, you know,
To that, yeah.
yeah, so.
Yep. But I think before we pass laws
Yeah, we
that
gotta
are
figure out
owners,
how
we
it's gonna
better
work.
know that there's a way out. Otherwise, you know,
I
it's
just
a
wanna know how
problem.
it's gonna work.
Yeah, yes.
I just don't wanna reach a dead end.
Oh, I think it's important to point
It's-
out, though, that
we
there
have to
are
make, yeah.
options. I mean, there are a lot of mitigation options, be it street tree, increasing the tree canopy, which Mr. Adams has made clear there are, I think, hundreds of
Yeah.
places for street trees. That's a partial credit. There's the mitigation bank, which you mentioned, and now that we do have a fee in lieu that's worth $400,000, that makes a mitigation bank very valuable potentially for a property owner to put on, or the city even, to put on one of their properties. And so, you know, but then there are also, you can get a credit through protecting existing forests elsewhere through a conservation easement. So there are a lot of different options besides
Right, that may
just-
be a way to go,
just
right, but we don't have
mitigation.
that now.
Right.
Well, you do if you can find a property owner who has existing forest and doesn't want to develop it. Maybe it's more, again, maybe it's worth more if you pay them something less than the fee in lieu,
Right.
200K to protect it in a conservation easement. That still saves both parties money. My point is there are plenty of options out there, and even with the Chesapeake Grove, I mean, I think it's important to clarify that Chesapeake Grove is critical area. It's different.
Right, yes.
But even with that, I mean, I know last time I met with the property owner, he was in communications with the local church who had property in the critical area, and he felt like that might be potential. So the good thing is it's forced them to go off site, because I know we've heard from Mr. Gutwald that, at least for forest conservation, properties have never had to do mitigation off site. They've never had to do that.
Right.
In this case, they're forced to, they're trying to, and there will be challenges. So I think, I'm glad that you met with staff. You know, I think I'm certainly open to things. If you think, if this passes, what can we do to help you through the process? You know, I'm not opposed to that. I think we do need, certainly part of the puzzle here and part of the solution.
Well, I think
but
that.
I think in terms of just one other thing, in terms of the balance, I hear you, but I also think the no net loss brings balance. That kind of stems the loss, the bleeding that we have. We could be growing more aggressive and going for a net gain of forest, but we're not. That's why I think what we're trying to get is a balance, because I think historically it's been out of balance. I think that's why developments has been such a huge focus in a lot of these elections. A lot of the impacts from overdevelopment have been huge issues, and I think that's because, at least on my soapbox, my view is there's been an out of balance, and all of my legislation is trying to bring that balance back. In my
Right.
view.
No, I think we have slightly different points of view, but it's okay. There has to be some debate about it and some discussion, and I would just suggest that you don't simply adopt this law as it is. Let's try to come up with something that amends it to make it so there's mitigation opportunities, because I don't suggest you adopt the law and then let's hope we are able to accomplish some of these mitigation requirements. I think that shifts the burden a little bit too harshly. So that's my
I hear you, but
ask.
I mean, yeah, this legislation's been introduced for probably 3-4 months now, and
Yep.
I haven't seen any suggestions from you or even recommended amendments in your testimony.
I
Technically,
will-
the public comments period is actually
Right.
closed, so it makes it a little difficult at the
Okay, but
11th hour to change things.
Well, I'll volunteer to submit some amendments, and, if, hopefully, they will receive favor, and maybe you want to have a second public hearing on the amendments, however you want to do it.
Yeah, or we can always include them in different future legislation.
Can I just add one thing?
Yes.
I'd just like to add that I also see it as an opportunity when I heard you say that there was an obstacle with the housing authority. I mean, that's red tape. I mean, look at Newtown 20. It doesn't have any trees, So
I
there's
understand.
opportunity there that is
Yep.
just,
Yeah.
it's a red tape issue. So that's where we
Certainly.
need to be the broker of some sort.
Fine.
Well, one of
Can
the
I
things-
just second that?
Yeah.
Sure.
Uh,
We're running short on time.
I realize that, but I think we really, I do like this idea of us thinking about some policy statement to the city about making room for some trees, but it's very depressing to go to Eastport Terrace and Harbor House. There's no vegetation there. I mean, I think really trying to work with our partners at the Housing Authority is another avenue that we should explore. I just can't imagine that wouldn't be receptive. When you look at Truxton Park, that is largely forested. I can't believe there's not room for more trees there, so I am kind of troubled that there's no acceptance of trees there. As I say, I think we need to be balanced. I'm very happy with where we're going with the legislation in general, but if there's places where we can balance, I'm very much in favor of that, and I think it improves the legislation's chances of being passed.
One
So-
thought I had, I know you want to wrap it up.
Yeah.
Do we really need an easement? If we plant
Need what?
easements. I mean, what if the housing authority, because that's part of the
Well,
problem.
I'm gonna stop you there, because we have to, easements are required under the state law. We
I
can't get
understand,
around that.
but why can't, we're adopting our own local version here, so why?
DNR's already shot down the county when they tried to do it.
Okay, all right,
We
well,
need to move on to the planning commission recommendations. I
I
wanna
agree
thank
with where you
you.
were going, but we did get shot down
Okay.
from the county.
I wanna thank you for your time, Mr.
all
Hunt.
right, well, thank you.
And we need to go over the planning commission recommendations. I'll try to breeze through these. If, Director Guild and I think Mr. Adams perhaps can come forward for staff. Not that you're representing the planning commission, but I think some of these questions are important. There's nobody from the planning commission here, correct? Yeah, so just to bring these up, planning commission did give a favorable recommendation to this ordinance. They did have a number of amendments they recommended. So I think it's important to go through these quick before we deliberate. First of all, they recommended setting up an ad hoc committee, which would help work out some of the planting location and details. But I think in light of what Mr. Adams submitted, I just wanted to get your thoughts. Do you think, Mr. Adams' report, do you think your office has addressed the concerns that this committee would look at already?
I think the initial idea behind the commission was to look at what our inventory was and to see if we needed to have additional funds allocated to us to do more. But we do have a tree canopy inventory for the city, street tree canopy for the city. It's just street trees, so it's not an inventory for the entire city. So I'll let Mr. Adams address the rest of that, but it really depends on what the planning commission's goals were for such a commission. They were pretty vague that night.
Yeah.
They just said, do we need a commission to study this further? And I think if they're trying to go beyond how many trees do we have and where you could plant, we've already addressed that here today. Do you have anything to add, Brian?
No, I would, and it's something I will look up. I'm curious to know if other jurisdictions provide developers with the sort of information that's being requested here. You know, are they providing a list of property owners who are readily available to accept 3 acres of mitigation? You know, I think that's something that needs to be looked into.
Yeah. But why? Why? I mean, even if they don't, I like the fact that you were planning to take your work and have the GIS work to at least identify the parcels.
I agree. I just don't know how far it sounds, you know, from the developers' angle, it sounds like they want us to essentially go out, find them, sign them up, you know, tell them exactly where to plant.
That's beyond what we're talking
Right,
about.
so
We have advanced the ball. You have advanced the ball by identifying the general areas. I
Right.
think it would be work for Sean Wampler, but it's certainly feasible to further break those areas into the parcels, and then someone can take that parcel number, go to get the SStat, and identify who the owner is. So at least we've made a good faith effort, and even if it's going further than other jurisdictions, why not? We can do it to help them, and the whole point is the forest. So anything we can do to make it easier to get more trees or save trees, I think we ought to do it if we can.
And we can discuss whether we would publicize something to the effect that, to the residents, that if you want to volunteer your property, and there's tax incentives related to that, you might
Right.
be able to identify, a pool of people that have property they would be willing to use for this.
Right, so in my case, I wouldn't put it where the holly tree was, but I might be willing to consider putting it along the back property line.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, there it is. Yeah, I mean, I think your office itself really, if you see a need, I mean, you're already meeting with various parties who are involved, I think, and I fully assume you're going to continue to do that even after this passes. But if there's anything else you need from us in terms of enabling legislation, but I mean, personally, I don't see the need right now to include the creation of a committee in this legislation, but on top of what we already have.
I agree with you. We already have the staff doing it.
Yeah.
Why create more bureaucracy and red tape?
And I did provide the summary that Brian provided to our office, to Bob Waldman, the chair of the planning commission. He was very, very appreciative. He said it was exactly what he was looking for as a
Okay.
first step.
Good to
So
know.
it may satisfy what he was after in the first place.
Okay, excellent, thank you. And so related, their second recommendation had to do with seeking funds for planting inventory. Getting funds so we can do an inventory for a planting. But it sounds like we already have that done for the, again, I don't think they were aware of this at the commission meeting when
Right.
Alderman Arnett and I attended. But, so we have it done for street trees. We have the urban tree canopy. And I think you actually submitted a request to do some kind of further inventory. Was that in the last budget?
No?
No, we were able to get the street tree inventory done
Okay.
last fiscal year.
Okay.
So no, I don't see the need to, seek funds to do a further inventory. I think, the analysis.
You hear that, Ms. Sutherland? No more funds needed?
I think between the analysis I provided and if we want to get further and find, ownership, like Jackie said earlier, and an intern could do something like that. But I don't think that we need to seek funds for any further inventory.
Okay. Any questions about that item? Let's
Nope.
see, the third, I think, is allowing mitigation outside the city. What would the implications be to allowing mitigation to happen outside? I think that was already touched on earlier, but.
It would not do us any good as far as our urban tree canopy goal that has to be accomplished within city limits. And also, we would receive absolutely no credit, Chesapeake Bay TMDL credit, for work done outside of the city.
Right, so anything that gets mitigated above the minimum in the state law, we can
We can take
potentially
credit.
claim as credit.
Yes, we can claim credit for
Which
it.
is essentially
Towards our WIP goals.
save taxpayer money.
But, Mr. Chair, I'm not saying we should act on this now, but if the ultimate goal is to protect the bay and protect the air, I certainly wouldn't be ill-disposed to exploring that at some later date. I think we should explore all the avenues within the city first, if we can, and work very hard to make that work. But the ultimate objective is the bay, and if that means it goes across the line and the county gets credit for it, I don't care. Ultimately, it's the bay that really is the objective. So I wouldn't propose anything, but I don't think we should rule it out of hand.
Real quick, would we get credit for HACA properties?
For HACA properties, if they're within the city limits, yes.
Okay, even with the state?
Anything in the city limits, even if it's county property,
Yeah.
it'd
Okay,
still
as
be
long as
within
it's
the city
within the
limits
city
and part
limits.
of our.
For purposes of the Bay TMDL, they're looking at geographic area,
Okay.
not
Yeah.
who owns the property.
property,
Yeah,
okay.
right.
Yeah. All right, so I'd recommend no action on that one. So they also recommended lower fee in lieu, which we talked about. That's another one, Alderman Arnett. I wouldn't be opposed to talking about that in the future. I'm not sure if I'd want to do that now, but I kind of like to see how it works. But.
Well, I think this is one where I might not agree. I think, I know when we came up with the $10 fee, there was no real basis for it. We didn't know at the time that Rockville was doing 5 and other jurisdictions. I don't know what the impact, and you heard me ask Mr. Hyatt, of cutting it from 10 to 5, but there is some comfort in at least having another jurisdiction that we're similar to. And if that is a mitigating or a balancing thing, there are 3 principles in the comprehensive plan. One is a robust economic, one is a good environment, and the third, which nobody seems to be espousing, is community character. That's the one where I think we're languishing, but we do have to keep into account a robust business environment. And so that's one where I would be willing to consider some change to that fee. And as I say, there's some comfort in at least having it at the level that someone else has it. So if it comes to a compromise to get the legislation passed, I would certainly be willing to consider that.
Okay. Alderman Tierney?
Jackie, what's your position on that? Would you prefer them to pay a fee, or would you prefer them to reforest? I mean, it's a philosophical question, I guess, you know. Yes, Pete?
Yeah, come on up if you want to. I didn't mean to leave you out. I didn't mean to leave you out there.
Oh, they can't hear you.
I mean,
You
it
might-
would,
Yeah, I know.
the first priority is retain
You
forest,
haven't learned yet.
obviously.
Yeah, yeah.
The effect of a mature tree versus a new tree is for a
Yeah.
stormwater retention benefit, and filtration benefit and carbon sequestration. You can go beyond just stormwater when you talk about these things, is much more beneficial. I don't have to point that out. And the fee in lieu was set so high because we don't have a lot of area left and a lot of tree canopy left. So it was meant to
Be a deterrent.
be a deterrent,
Yeah.
as
Yeah,
Alderman
absolutely.
Arnett has pointed out, because he was on the city council then. And
And-
so if you might be going backwards, so I don't know how much,
Yeah.
how much backsliding you want to do
Yeah.
away from your current fee in lieu.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the planning commission's logic was there, especially after.
Yeah, and I wasn't,
Yeah.
wasn't privy to that, so it'll be
Yeah.
interesting to learn more about the legislative history on that.
Oh, Peter's
ahead,
dying there.
You presume logic?
I threw you that softball,
I'm being
Pete.
respectful.
I don't know if I need to add any more, but Alderman Tierney knows this. I'm not a big proponent of fees. Having been the former director in Harford County, I was the one that got rid of the fee in lieu for the Forest Conservation Act in Harford County, because we are not the best stewards of money. And I don't want the money, I want the tree. I don't want I don't want the money, I want the improvement. And I am consistent with that, whether it allows for the fee in lieu of or not. You can apply it across the board to a whole bunch of different things. I don't want the money. I constantly argue with developers, give me the improvement, whatever it is, whether it's trees or road improvements or whatever the case. I don't want the money. So I'm a big proponent against that. So the one thing I would add, and Mr. Hyatt may not appreciate this, but when you think about the fee, one of the Forest Conservation Act, when you establish a fee, land costs. That fee is to include acquiring or encumbering that land. So the cost can include the cost of land to be able to put the tree on the land, not just planting the tree. So that is I thought, because I wasn't part of your committee, Alderman Arnett, but I thought maybe that $10 was looking at the cost of land, and because it's so scarce, and the cost of land does raise that. And most municipalities, yes, many counties, we were 40 cents a square foot in Harford County, and the DNR questioned that, because where are you going to get the land? We had lots of land that was available to us. Cities, and I can think of other municipalities that are $2.50, to $5 a range that I'm familiar with, and I was wondering why because of land. It was the ability to encumber that land.
Yeah.
So I would just add that to when you think of fee in lieu.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm not a proponent of the fee in lieu, and all the reasons that Jackie mentioned, but that's across the board in any situation, so.
Thank you, Mr. Gutwell, that was helpful. Is there any other discussion about the fee in lieu at this point? Okay, so moving on, the next item is, they recommended keeping track of the mitigation, but I think this is already a requirement of Forest Conservation Act, if I'm not mistaken. Anybody want to chime in, feel free.
For any FCA project, we are tracking annually and reporting to the DNR.
Okay.
And then we have a biennial review.
Okay. Anything else on that one? The last item they recommended had to do with the grace period. But again, I think it's important to consider what the impact of a grace period would be. And I think that was already mentioned earlier, that'd be about 30 acres potentially, depending on when these projects get approved, but there are a certain number of them that are in the process right now. So I mean, personally, I'm not quite in favor of any kind of grace period at this junction. Any-
No,
any other-
I agree. The rate we're losing acreage doesn't make me feel warm towards forestalling and allowing the loss of even more acres. So
Yeah.
I understand why the commission asked us to consider it, and I think we have.
Yeah, and then, did you have any thoughts?
So I'm not clear, so does this mean that if they have an approved forest conservation plan, if we can still go back to them and with this ordinance, then they're not grandfathered in? Is that what this is saying?
The way it's currently worded is that it applies to all applications unless they have
Unless they have
final approval for the forest conservation plan,
final
which-
approval, is that
yeah.
right? Okay.
which occurs at the end of the process at this point. That's the way it's currently worded,
Well, it
right?
needs to clarify that, because all it says is forest conservation plan. We need to say final or preliminary, because the code distinguishes the difference between the two.
Let
We
me
had
check.
that, I mean, I thought that was going to be amended.
When do they get preliminary, when do
Well-
they get final? Oh, sorry.
So,
Does it say final? I thought it just said
it says,
forest.
whereas forest conservation plans approved prior to the effective date of this ordinance remain subject to the laws at the time of approval. So forest conservation plans don't get approved until the end. I mean, the preliminary is a
Okay.
different stage of
That's-
approval as far as
I
I'm.
was just trying to clarify final versus preliminary.
Right.
Preliminary is at site design, final is
Right.
when we issue the grading permit.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it doesn't get, the final forest conservation plan does not get approved until we approve the grading permit with the site plan.
Yeah,
So-
yeah. At this point, I'd kind of rather stick with how it's written, although, I mean, we could look at reducing the threshold to preliminary forest conservation plans.
Well, even if it
But
was
with-
final, I would just like it to say final forest conservation plan. That's what I'm getting at.
So there's no
Because I don't want to get into an
ambiguity
argument with Alan on, no, just kidding.
where it applies. So
Where it applies.
Yeah,
I thought it was with the grading permit, which
Well,
is pretty
essentially-
definitive, but
essentially it is.
That's the way he's, I mean, I understand that, but I just, in the law, it'd be nice to specifically
Right.
state,
Yeah.
since the code, since,
Well, we have to
forest-
state our intention clear. I mean, if,
okay,
that might be a question for Mr. Melnick, if the way it's worded is clear enough to distinguish that it's with the final forest conservation plan, if that's, I mean,
well,
maybe we can always.
happy to capture the intent of the legislature.
Okay.
so the
Thank-
final forest
We've discussed it
conservation,
already.
the plan is final when they get the grading permit, so why don't we mention upon receipt of grading permit in there
All
somehow?
you have to say is put the word final in there, and that would make me happy.
Final, okay, all right.
Well, yeah, and we can always compromise, but, you know, at the rate of how long this is taking to get adopted, you know, we'll see. But it's really, there's only one project that has the preliminary forest conservation plan approval. That would be, where do I have that list? That would be exempted, and that was, I think, so I can bring this up.
I think Terrapin Station's the only one.
Yeah, that's it, yeah.
Tyler Heights was out there, but it got its grading
Yeah.
permit, so.
So, in that project, it's 0.49 acres of forest to be removed. They're replacing 0.8. They may have other options, but I mean, that may be something we can consider when it comes back to the council for final vote, if we need to amend it, unless the committee has thoughts on doing that now. But I'm also kind of hesitant, because if this doesn't get passed for another 5 weeks, which at this point it may not, we kind of need to keep our options open in terms of how to adjust this, depending on how quickly these projects get through the process.
What's the difference, I mean, the grading plan, you're delineating forest areas there, right? And so could we use the grading plan, or which would you prefer?
For the final, okay, so for the preliminary forest conservation plan, everything's sort of ironed out in terms of site design, so we know what areas are going into forest conservation.
Right,
The grading permit delineates all the documents, like the easements, the forest conservation easements are recorded at the point when they're doing the grading permit. So
Okay.
that's when we issue the final forest conservation plan, because all the documents are checked off and recorded in the court records, and we can now let them
Yeah.
disturb, push dirt
Okay.
and clear
So,
trees.
so once that's established.
Part
that
of the
would-
preliminary is
um,
establishing what the areas are, but also listing the documents that need to be recorded, like the conservation areas, as a condition of the preliminary. And that actually gets completed at the grading permit stage. So we're not going to get the final check off until those documents are recorded.
Okay.
Any other thoughts, Alderwoman Tierney? It's 5 o'clock, I want to try to wrap this up. Do you have any other thoughts on that? Okay. So, thank you, and I guess I'll work with city attorney about making sure our intent is clearly portrayed in here. I think I could talk to you afterwards about that, because I don't think we're going to make any motion on that right now. I mean, if that's the sense of the committee. And, all right, so I guess, thank you for your time. That concludes the planning commission items. Is there any motion from the committee that we want to consider? Any amendments, any motion at this point? People comfortable with it?
Yeah, I guess this is the point where we recommend favorable approval to the city council.
If that's the, are you okay with how this is? Do you want to see anything changed?
We need to work some stuff out. I think we need a path forward on some of the roadblocks, feel more comfortable about that we're going to work on trying to make this inventory a reality. I mean, the positive thing is we have an inventory of places to reforest, and we need a path to ensure.
So the way to do that would be to offer an amendment to the legislation.
Okay.
So,
Or what inventory would you want?
Well, we have one, right, from,
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at. Would you need anything in addition to this?
No, this
and
is-
in addition to what staff has?
I think we have to incorporate this somehow, right, or?
Let me see here.
I like the GPS.
Well, we could
kind of
make a new
idea.
whereas that says, well, actually, that may not make sense. But it's an accompaniment to the legislation at this point.
Yeah,
Um,
okay.
I'm trying to think, is there another way we could relay our desire to,
The other thing I want to introduce is some way of prioritizing, getting higher marks on street trees versus open area kind of thing. You know what I mean? Like give different,
I would give street trees a lower mark.
I mean, did I say that the wrong way?
Yeah, well-
I think I know what you mean. I think
yeah.
that's going to be
That's down the road.
up to our staff, Mr. Adams, to
What
be
happened
able
to our
to, to be able to determine a priority to present the developers of, here are areas we prefer to get reforested first, or here's where we want street trees first. I think that would have to come from,
Is that something
staff.
you'd be receptive to doing when you talk to a developer and say, we would prefer, this over?
can you come up and just say it on the record, so that'll hopefully allay Alderwoman Tierney's, because you'll be on the record making a commitment to,
Yeah, 'cause we're trying to add language that we're moving forward on this inventory and how it would work.
Could you
And-
just repeat the question for me, please?
Would you be able to, when you sit down with a developer and go over the the reforestation plan, or the inventory available, I guess that's the first question. Yeah, I know you're hesitant to get too into the weeds, no pun intended, but you would have a list and you would suggest locations? I don't want to,
based on priority, you're saying?
but based on priority, or?
Yeah, I think it would be a combination of, how much space is needed, first of all, and then we would look at the sites and,
Yep.
if it was something small enough that we could use street trees as the mitigation, that might
Yeah.
be the
So
preferred route.
Yeah, and so that's a conversation that will
then-
happen then, that you will, because your last testimony, you sounded kind of hesitant in doing too much, right? And I don't want to
Yeah.
assume you're going to do more than you can without
Right.
adding any more staff.
Right,
Yeah.
right. I'm hesitant to say that I'm gonna, get into meeting with property owners to discuss,
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
agreements.
Easements and all that kind of
Yeah.
stuff.
It
I
may
mean, I
help
can make
that-
recommendations as to where I think may
Right.
be good options, to where you could
Yeah.
approach, and I can provide property owner information. And the
Yeah.
street tree locations, I can provide exact
Okay.
exact locations.
And
Okay.
that's actually already a requirement in the Forest Conservation Act, is the reforestation has the priority forest you hear about, steep slopes,
Okay.
stream buffers. It's actually, there's a ranking
Okay.
in terms of where they
Alright.
need to look first. So that's actually
So we can
in many
talk
ways
into that.
already
Okay, yeah,
addressed.
okay.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. Is there anything else, Alderman Tierney,
No,
you'd like
no.
to speak of? Okay.
So I had made a motion that we make a favorable recommendation to the council on whatever this is, 2718?
I second that we make a favorable recommendation on this legislation.
Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right, motion passes. Thank you, and thank you to staff and all the public. And I apologize to Public Works staff for getting here. I'll try to keep this moving quickly. We'll move right into the stormwater. If staff wants to come up, we can get started with that resolution.
So when we say that, what do we do with the planning commission? We revisit those during the city council meeting? The planning commission
Well, I think
recommendations?
they're just, it turns out they don't really need it.
Yeah, we
Recommendations
didn't
already
make an
addressed.
amendment or anything.
Thank you, gentlemen. Can you just state your name and for the
Sure.
record?
David Gerald, Director of Public Works.
Matthew Waters, City Stormwater Engineer.
Thank you. So let me just get my head around this one now. So the stormwater resolution, and this is I'm gonna be introducing an amendment to kind of to simplify things a bit. I think I shared it with my committee members just to take out the percentages. I'm not sure if Ms. Sutherland may have shared it with you already. So it takes, I think, it takes some of this discussion off the table in the sense that I think we don't have to have as much. Hopefully, it simplifies things and simplifies the potential passage. I think my colleagues know my intention with this, so I guess I want to kind of start off and get the thoughts from Public Works here in terms of the legislation. I know, again, the way it would be amended would be, it would essentially be relying and encouraging you to use your discretion on for that provision of our code. And so just want to get your thoughts, your level of comfort with using that kind of discretion, your understanding of the law, that kind of thing.
Okay. Well, I will start, and then Matt will add things or answer the hard questions depending on where we go with this. But just by way of background, well, first of all, it's clarification. So what we're talking about here is stormwater management for post-construction of development.
Right.
We've had a lot of issues in the city with this very wet summer with stormwater issues during the construction process. AYC, Primrose, some other places where we've had issues. That's not what we're talking about is during construction. What we're talking about is post-construction. So I've got some prepared notes. So I'm going to look at these. I don't usually do this, but I want to make sure I hit the high points here.
Sure.
So the City of Annapolis follows the state of Maryland guidelines and requirements and requires developments to provide what's called ESD to MEP. So that's environmental site design to the maximum extent practicable. So each development is classified either as a new development or as a redevelopment. And the criteria for stormwater management varies for those two. So in short, if the existing percent of impervious area exceeds 40%, it's considered redevelopment. Otherwise, it's new development. So new development currently requires treatment of 100% of the calculated volume of runoff from the site. And that volume to be treated is calculated based on the impervious area and the design storm based on the soil type and the impervious percentage. So the design storm varies for new development based on again, the soil type and how much of the area is going to be impervious after development. Redevelopment currently requires treatment of 50% of the calculated volume, And that volume's calculated based on 50% of the post-construction impervious area. So if there's going to be 2 acres of impervious area after development, 1 acre of that has to be treated, and it's a 1-inch storm. So there's been a lot of discussion, and you mentioned it, about the city code allowing discretion to me, to the Public Works Director, in the stormwater treatment required for development. The city has and will continue to use the discretion in cases where the downstream stormwater conveyance system can't handle the additional flows. So for example, if there's substandard outfalls downstream from the development, we would require a higher level of treatment so that we don't flood the area. Discretion has not been applied to water quality impacts because the state minimums were developed based on science of expected pollutant removal. So for example, capturing 1.5 inches of rainfall instead of the 1 inch that's currently required for redevelopment would increase the TSS, the total suspended solids removal, from 70% to 80%, and the total nitrogen removal from 57% to 64%. So the state, the state was looking at, the state has impaired water bodies as we have impaired water bodies, and the Chesapeake Bay is the big one. So when they established these standards, they were considering impaired water bodies, and they established the science based on treating what is a reasonable amount, providing a reasonable amount of treatment for a reasonable construction impact. So, to answer the question that a lot of people have asked, if I was directed to use discretion in establishing what the stormwater treatment requirement would be, I would have to implement a new review process for these projects. So right now the way we review these projects is the developer puts together a conceptual site plan, submits it, we look at it, and we see if they're meeting the minimum requirements. If they are, then they're basically good to go. That's an oversimplification, but that's sort of the way it works. So it would be unfair to the developers if after they submitted that, if I arbitrarily said, well, we want you to be 75% instead of 50%, or 55%, or 100%, or pick a number. Number one, I wouldn't have a basis for establishing that percentage. But number two, they've already prepared the plans in accordance with the code, and then we're dropping in sort of late in the game and saying, well, we don't think that's quite enough. Go ahead and add a little bit more. So what we would change it to is that we would become involved before they ever, during their initial design process, before they ever submit the plans. So we would have to be involved with the design, and we would work together with their engineer, and this is doable, work with their engineer to figure out what the MEP is, what the right number is, what the percentage is that makes sense, and isn't overly expensive, or unreasonably expensive, but yet captures the goals that we would want. So it would take a lot more staff time to do that. Matt's a pretty busy guy. He would be the guy that would be doing that. So he would be going out and meeting with the developers and their engineers on each of these projects before they submitted to work out what we think the MEP is. So that being said, any change in the cities, because we think that if the council wants to change a percentage, it should do it via an ordinance and not just say, Public Works Director, you figure out what you think is right and impose that on the developers. I mean, I always use the example of, road that we say has a 35-mile-per-hour speed limit, but we tell the police officer, well, if you want to enforce it at 25, you can do that, or at 10, or at 30, or whatever the case might be. It makes it very difficult for the entity that has to do that. So anyway, if we change the stormwater management requirements in our code, we'll have to submit those to MDE for their approval. So I asked them to review the original version of the resolution just to get their input, and they provided us a letter yesterday. It's dated October 16th. It's addressed to me, and it's from Stuart Comstock, who's the acting program review division chief for the Water and Science Administration of MDE. So I'd like to just read just a few parts of this. I'll try to summarize this and keep it short. But here's what he had to say. So the proposed resolution requires all new development applications exempting those involving a maximum one single-family dwelling to treat more than the minimum stormwater requirements by utilizing at least 100% for redevelopment and 150% for new development. So we knew about that. So according to the resolution, these proposed increases in treatment are intended to help the city better meet TMDL requirements and improve local water quality. As currently written, the proposed resolution does not explicitly state the unit at which 100% and 150% treatment is required. Clear and explicit language is needed to prevent ambiguity. The department recommends that a quantifiable measurement be stated in the new requirement. Without a defined and measurable parameter, the proposed resolution would not be acceptable according to the Code of Maryland Regulations, COMAR. Furthermore, the department recommends that the city explore alternatives to requiring 100% and 150% treatment. As stated above, current regulations and code require the use of ESD to MEP. By utilizing ESD to MEP throughout a construction site, stormwater management requirements can be met at the source. Providing additional treatment will eventually allow for diminishing returns in water quality. Additionally, by requiring 100% or 150% treatment, that is between 2.7 and 4 inches of rainfall, larger structural practices or more ESD and alternative practices may be needed to meet the treatment requirements. This can utilize more land, which can be counter to the principles of ESD to MEP. The department suggests that one alternative to requiring 100% and 150% treatment would be to allow applicants to fund restoration projects elsewhere in the city. In other words, the fee in lieu. This can provide for targeted projects that are focused on addressing pollutants of concern in impaired watersheds. This approach can also aid in fulfilling the planning requirement of the MS4 permit. So yesterday at the meeting that has been discussed during the last agenda item, we started discussion of this to do a fee in lieu instead of additional requirements. The nice thing about that is we have a whole list of projects that we need to do, and right now the city's sort of on the hook to fund those themselves. So if in fact we do want developers to contribute towards the MS4 goal, that would be one way to do it, is that we would require the state required treatment, but then add an additional fee in lieu of some percent to be established by the council for them to pay fee in lieu, so then we could apply that money to our MS4 projects, and it wouldn't have to be 100% funded by the city. We're hiring Greenvest to help us with that. The contract's being signed, so we'll have them on board soon. So that would help us with an additional funding source for that. So I think that, I guess the two options that come to mind for me and that I sort of, hopefully you gather from this whole discussion, is number one, if we do want to have MEP and we still want discretion from the Public Works Director, we need to switch over to getting involved early in the process and help with the design process, so we can figure out early on for each development what the MEP is, and then we would apply that percentage to that development. You can't just arbitrarily do it otherwise. As an option is this whole fee in lieu, where we apply the funds to the projects. Unlike the reforestation, we have projects that we need to do, and we're going to pay for those otherwise. So developer money to help with those would be very beneficial.
Can I just clarify something real quick?
Sure.
Some of the things that David said. So David said about redevelopment volume that's being treated, that the area that's looked at for redevelopment volume is based on the area within limited disturbance, not the whole site. So that's a big clarification there. And then the other thing I just wanted to point out to you is that David quoted some science numbers in there. So if you go to a document called the Accounting for Stormwater Waste Load Allocations and Impervious Acres Treated, it was put out by MDE. It's dated August 2014. in table 6, page 16 of this document is where there's some more information, and it goes through all the percent and percents that you get credit for per rainfall depth or runoff depth that's treated, and that's for total suspended solids, phosphorus, and nitrogen.
Yeah, and Mr. Jarrell, can you share with us your testimony? So we can read it over?
Yeah.
Alderwoman Terry?
Yeah, so I always kind of had a problem with how to calculate the 100 and the 150, but so that's still an issue if, on the fee in lieu of, what are you quantifying? What is the fee in lieu of based on? You're meeting MDE minimum requirements, but if the developer would like to do more, what is that more? And is that where the fee in lieu of comes in?
So originally the proposal was to bump the numbers up to 100% for redevelopment and 150% for new development. So what we're talking about is additional treatment above the state requirements. So if the council is still interested in additional treatment above the state requirements, it could be in a fee in lieu process. Because, you know, we heard testimony about how difficult that's going to be for a lot of sites to have that additional treatment. So what we could ask for instead, since we have projects identified that we plan to do, is calculate the cost of that additional treatment and have them pay that as fee in lieu.
So wouldn't you still then be introducing discretion going, or are you saying the ordinance would say 100 and it would go, the ordinance would say 100 and 150?
Yeah, I think that would be best if the ordinance specified what amount that they would contribute above the state requirement.
So there's no other way for them to go above the minimum unless we stipulate 100 and 150?
No. So if in fact you want us to apply discretion, and you have my boss direct me to do that, have the city manager direct me to do that, what we need to do is get involved early in the design process so we can, on a case-by-case basis, development by development basis, work with the designers to see what the MEP truly is. Because I don't think it's one number fits all. I really don't.
Right. Now, Leo Wilson last council meeting, he seemed, his testimony implied that was sort of what was done. I don't know if you heard his testimony. It sounded like everybody got involved early and looked at the best, but maybe I just heard him. Sounds like you don't do that now.
Yeah, no, I don't think we did.
I don't know if you remember hearing him.
So, kind of what Leo was talking about with that was that they design something, they bring it in, and that's when we review it. So
it's already designed to the minimum.
It's already designed, yeah.
Yeah,
and
okay.
we do try to touch base. If there's a difficult project, I've had engineers reach out to me and say, hey, I have this difficult project, what do you think would work? And we talk about that, and it's not as often, and you know, scheduling makes it difficult sometimes because they want to get their projects in for review as quickly as possible.
Okay. Thank you.
Just before I turn over the floor to you, Alderman, so I hear what you're saying in terms of if you are directed to use discretion, you need to get involved early in the process. But isn't there already a concept plan phase included in the stormwater management review process? Is that?
Yeah, so there is, and so the plans come in with the concept designs already prepared. What I would propose is even before those are submitted, when they're first starting to do that engineering and that design work for those, that we get involved and work out. Because the concept design already shows where the stormwater practices are going to be. So they've already been sized, they've already been located, they've planned around those. So that's, I mean, it's not late in the process, but it certainly isn't the ideal time in the process for us to go back and say, we want you to add more stormwater practices. I would suggest that it's better to do that before they ever submit that we work in a collaborative way to develop what the MEP is so that they can then capture that in their drawings that they submit as the concept site plans.
Additionally, too, a lot of times when the concept plans come in, they're actually over-designed for a concept level. There's a lot of times where I see storm drain profiles and flow tabulations in there, which is just, should not be really designed at this point unless there's a potential that there's issues like they have a pipe that's too flat or something like that, and saying, I could say like, well, I don't think this is going to I don't think water's gonna flow through this correctly. You know, that's a situation where I would wanna see a pipe profile, but almost every single site design plan that comes in is over-designed.
Alderman Renner?
So, starting at a high level and working backwards, the reason we chose doing a resolution rather than a hard number ordinance is because we don't know, and maybe you do and you can tell us, but we don't know whether 100 and 150 are achievable. We heard testimony from, I think it was Tom Baum, about one of his redevelopment projects where 50 was the max he could squeeze out. And so if we make it 100 for him for redevelopment, I think the answer would be, well, then I'm not gonna redevelop. And now you're left with 100% not treated. And so, launching from that back to what you said, Director Gerald, we don't need legislation for you to get involved earlier in the process. I mean, that could be just a change in procedures that DPW uses, right? Or do we need to give you some kind of a safeguard to, or sanction to get involved earlier? And I like the word you used, in a collaborative process.
No, and I guess what I was addressing is that the resolution originally had numbers plugged in. It had 100 and 150. And so my point in that is the numbers are really difficult in that
Right.
case. We understand the discretion if we are going to apply discretion. We haven't in the past because we think the state law are the right numbers.
Right.
But if we are going to apply discretion and we're going to always try for MEP, then I think you need to give that direction is just to do MEP, and then we'll start that collaborative
Right.
process. I think alternatively, if you want to set a number, then we still work with the MEP, and then they just pay a fee in lieu of whatever the difference is.
Right.
So that's the fee in lieu option. That's.
See, I for one was worried about setting a hard number. And I was hoping, and in fact, I think my hopes are realized. First of all, thank you for your testimony, and it made the whole process much clearer. I understood better what you're facing. But it does sound to me like there is a way where we can, early in the process, where it's better off for everybody else, to try to strive for the maximum of what we can get. Again, financial considerations are part of that. If 51% is the maximum we can squeeze out just because of the particulars of the property, that's good enough for me. I mean, if you can't get more, you can't get more. I'd hate to make it the legislation hard and fast saying, well, you can only do 51, but we're requiring 100. That doesn't make sense. It's actually, it makes us look foolish. We're asking for more than we can possibly get. And I'm not qualified to make that judgment. You are. And so what the overall thrust of this was, we wanted to have a resolution that made the statement, we're not going to just accept the minimum when more is possibly attainable. And you've given us now 2 ways where we can get more. One is we can get involved earlier in the process, and you can say, you know, looks like you can get 80, and they would say, yeah, but 70 we can do relatively effectively because we can do this and this. To get that extra 10% is going to cost us $100,000 more or something like that. And I'm more than happy for you to be the judge of the reasonableness of, well, that's asking too much of the developer. So we can get involved earlier. The other thing you said, though, that really caught my attention was maybe we have an alternative where they can be helping finance off-site other projects where we need help. So this is my understanding of what happened at the Eastport Shopping Center. They actually, as I understand, and this could be, it is secondhand, so it could be hearsay, they actually wanted to do some mediation on that branch of Back Creek, but it was off-site, and I think the sense was we don't want to have to be dealing with off-site kinds of things. You need to manage it on your site. I kind of like the idea of getting them to help fix up that branch of Back Creek, but you have reasons why, in order for you to be able to control it, you were thinking otherwise. But what you said is, maybe they can only give us 55% at the shopping center, but we can negotiate with them, but you can do this, help clean up, that's a scuzzy area there, and it stinks sometimes in the summertime. If they could help clean out, remember recently we had somebody come in and clean up all the underbrush. I think it was when they put in the townhouses for that area there, right off the southern side of that branch. Anyway, so you already, I think, just by having this dialogue, I think we've come up with two things which are pretty appealing to me. I don't know how it affects the rest of the committee, but if you were going to be involved earlier in the process, is that something where we even need to have a resolution or an ordinance to get you there? And if so, tell us what you need.
No, I just need 3 more mats.
Three more
Matt Waters.
Okay.
Because I mean, he's overloaded now with just reviewing the plans, and he would still be reviewing the plans, even though he was involved with helping get started.
Right.
So it's a bit of a work pill to take that on, because we would have a lot more involvement with the design.
Okay, that's fair enough, and I think that's part of what the city manager has emphasized to us, is that he can do anything, we just can't do everything, and we certainly can't do everything without the budget and the staff to do it. And we are, sooner or later, this council is gonna have to start making choices and establishing priorities, and we just can't keep raising the tax rate forever. But I think that's fair to know, and it would be good information to get. If we took this step of getting involved earlier, what are the resources for you that would be required to do it?
The good news is not general fund, right? It's stormwater fund, so.
Right.
And it directly benefits the stormwater and the water quality, so.
Right.
The other thing too to add with that is not just designing these things, but on the other end, when it's constructed and everything's in, the other problem that we have is, are they actually functioning properly? You know, and post-construction inspections, they yield some pretty bad results so far. You know, the other week I did a few bond inspections, which includes reviewing the stormwater management as it's constructed, and of all the sites I went to, about 20 to 25% of them passed.
Really?
So,
how's St. Luke's doing?
I prefer not to talk about
Not
that.
open up that can of worms right now.
That's a different type of project.
I'll get you in a next Alderwoman.
Oh, sure,
Just want to say a few things. And yeah, I completely, having worked with Matt, I understand how overloaded I'm sure he still is and how much he was back then. I remember seeing his desk and his pile of plans to review. But like you said, I think that's something we may need to work into our stormwater fee. I know we'll be getting a presentation on that tomorrow. It'd be interesting to see how they recommend increasing it or not. That may be something we need to look at in the next budget in terms of getting more mats. But so I just want to clarify. So it sounds like you haven't been using the discretion from this point up until this point.
We haven't for the water quality side. We have for the more the hydraulic side, the flood control, flood avoidance.
And so, can you explain just more of why you haven't used that discretion?
Because the state requirements, the 50% and 100% are based on good science, better science than we have, right? Compare their science to our science, and they went out. I mean, they were based on treatment of an impaired water body too, the Chesapeake Bay. And they have a good basis. Treatment of the first inch, the first flush, treats a large percentage of the pollutants that we're trying to reach. So, based on that science and based on a lack of clear evidence of what the results would be if we set higher numbers, or what even the basis would be to set higher numbers, led us to just follow the numbers that are in the code. I mean, it's past practice to change all of a sudden on a particular development, just, it's difficult. And I think the staff report talks about being arbitrary and capricious, but, you know, there is concern about doing that after all these years, at least the years that I've been here, 8 years of insisting on a certain standard, 50% and 100%, and then all of a sudden change it for some developments based on what, you know, it's
Well,
difficult.
I mean, I remember when I was doing reviews, I know we were always told it's a case-by-case basis. When you review one permit one way, it doesn't mean that's gonna be the same. I mean, you have the code to adhere to, but there's enough discretion in a lot of our code, especially environmental. I mean, you've got a 100-foot buffer for critical area that can be expanded using discretion. You have the stream buffers in the Forest Conservation Act that can be expanded. You have significant tree provision in the Forest Conservation Act, which is very discretionary. Priority forest provisions, which again are very discretionary, not to mention the enforcement provisions. So, you know, I hear you, but I'm not sure I entirely agree, because I think, yes, the state has put a lot of science behind it, but they also did include those standards, benchmarks, for lack of a better word, to use discretion on, right? They included, they say the erosion issues, they say the flooding issues, they say the water quality issues are reasons to go above that minimum. And I think they set that minimum as a good floor, but I don't think that's to say that's the ideal circumstance in all situations. I think some sites, yes, which is why I kind of lean towards taking out the percentage in the resolution, is because I think some sites they're not going to be able to do it. I heard what the developers have said, but I think in many others you can increase that. And
yeah, and we always try and take a balanced view. You know, we're pro-environment, but we're also pro-development, and so you try to be balanced in every case. And the state guidelines seem reasonable. And you know, maybe it's Monday morning quarterbacking to say, well, you should have done this and you should have done that. But our approach was always reasonable. It was set expectations for the developers that they understood what the requirements were going to be, and that's what we really need to do. And that's why, you know, saying use discretion and vary it by development is difficult, because that creates great uncertainty among the developers of what it's going to be for their development. We need to be more firm.
I understand, but that's a fact of life for a lot of our regulations. Like I said, all those environmental regulations have a lot of discretion built in, not to mention all the zoning regulations that have, you know, meets the character of a neighborhood. I mean, that's really subjective, and it has a lot of inherent discretion. So, I mean, that's where I hear you, but I think I'd also be kind of disturbed if I heard that staff wasn't using their discretion on all these other laws that were passed, statutes that were passed with the legislative intent to give you that discretion. So, I mean, I do want to if you're not comfortable using that, I do want to find out what we can do to help to put you in a more comfortable place where you feel like you can use that. And that's what I was trying to do with this resolution, is to say, we've got your back, we support you, please start using that discretion.
Well, I kind of heard two different things, and I don't want to sit here and just argue about this back and forth. But you know, what you say is you gave me the ability to use discretion. So I've used my discretion. My discretion is to apply the state standards. Now, whether that's right or wrong, we can debate. But the discretion that you gave me was used, and I applied the state standards.
Did you want to come up?
And I think I know the answer to this on one hand, but I don't know the answer to this on the other hand, or in one part, not the other part. When the planning and zoning officer is given the latitude to use discretion in making his decisions, I believe that there is an appeal of that. If someone doesn't like his decision, we have a process where that can be appealed, and that could result in a different outcome if someone decided that decision was arbitrary and capricious, short of that person having to sue us.
Nope.
Board of Appeals process,
No.
et cetera?
No, that's the problem. That's a topic of discussion we had with the planning director and the city attorney. It is now, because of changes we made a while ago, it used to be that you could appeal the planning director or the planning commission to the Board of Appeals. We took that out. So now, if you don't think they did it right, you gotta go to the circuit court, and I can tell you, because I wanted to take a case from the Board of Appeals to the circuit court, $50,000. You gotta feel pretty
From the
strongly.
Board of Appeals to the circuit court.
This was appeal of the density calculation.
Right,
So
from the
it
Board of
went to-
Appeals, not
it's-
from Pete.
It started at the Board of Appeals. Right now, you go to the Board of Appeals, or you go to the planning director of the planning commission. And the only way you can appeal that is to go to circuit court
But
now.
what I understand that you have to appeal the Board of Appeals decision to the circuit court. But what I'm saying is you can appeal the planning director's decision to the Board of Appeals. No?
Nope, not the way we fixed it, at least not the way I understand it.
Well, I think there's an administrative appeal for decisions that are based solely on the discretion of the director, but, I
Well,
mean,
so that's,
when I
okay,
was
so
back
that's
with,
what I'm trying to,
with-
so like I said, I don't necessarily know the answer, but that would be my question, and where there may be a difference in what you're suggesting is up to the discretion and judgment of the planning and zoning director, or what's up to the discretion and judgment of someone with respect to forest conservation or something like that, that if he makes a decision based on his discretion and judgment on this stormwater,
but
there's no appeal.
But previously, I mean, when there was DNEP where I was working, we did have a lot of discretion we could use. I think appeals, there was no way, I think appeals may have gone to the Building Board of Appeals if there was something in that instance,
Okay, so
but
there-
usually, but through the review process, I think the developers also know that we have that discretion to use. I mean, I know, I've
But-
heard the same thing from other
but if
folks,
they
but let me
weren't-
finish this point though. I think there are folks in planning and zoning who like the discretion because they use it a lot to try to get better projects. And so I think it's, to hear different standards in different departments is kind of,
I'm not arguing with that. What
frustrating.
I'm saying is there a distinction in a director applying judgment and discretion when that decision can be appealed to someone versus the director applying discretion and judgment
Yeah.
when it can't be appealed?
Do you
So if
really-
he applies discretion and judgment in this stormwater matter, can that be appealed? Can it even be a lawsuit that goes to the circuit court? I don't know. So that's, my question is just making sure if you're gonna take one as the basis to justify the other, that they are in fact comparable.
like, Mr. Melnick, and if there's any, Ms. Gollard, I see you on the edge of your seat, feel free to come up too if you have any comments, but, Mr. Melnick?
Well, I was originally going to come up because I understand that we're talking about two things. We're talking about the timing at which Mr. Gerald would get involved, but I believe Mr. Gerald also indicated a need to have some criteria upon which to exercise his discretion once he is in that process at an earlier time. Mr. Gerald, did I hear that right? That you would need some sort of criteria upon which to exercise your discretion in order for,
That was certainly help with it, but I don't think that was the council intent. I think it was complete just discretion to apply numbers.
So from where I'm sitting, I want to make sure that my director of Public Works has a reasonable basis upon which to make a decision. If he hasn't been exercising discretion because he's been relying on the expertise of the state MDE for their 100%, 50 and 100 as opposed to this, the thought now of 100 and 150, if his concern was that seemed to be what was reasonable, and since there's a lot of projects and a lot of if there's a lot of issues throughout the city that it would be difficult to differentiate one from another, it seemed to me that there would need to be some additional criteria that he would look at in order to exercise his discretion in a meaningful way and be able to, then if there is an appeal, whether it's an administrative appeal and then an appeal to circuit court or just directly to circuit court, that we'd be able to look at the court and say, the director has the administrative expertise to make a reasonable and rational decision, and that the court must give that deference in determining whether that decision was proper or whether it was arbitrary and capricious. Is there substantial evidence to support that decision? And I want to make sure that the Director of Public Works has the criteria or standards or whatever it is, the basis upon which to formulate a reasonable decision
Sure, yeah.
above that which the MDE stated in state law.
Yeah, and I think some of that's already, again, in there. It lists, again, the erosion, water quality issues, the flooding. Just like similarly, again, the critical area 100-foot buffer lists certain things like steep slopes, I think highly erodible soils, but they even have the catch-all of other sensitive areas. Well, you know, what in the world are sensitive areas? But that's already built into the critical area law. But then we also have, again, the 100-foot buffer expansion for Forest Conservation Act, and there is no, if I recall, that there is no specific criteria. It's, again, that's something staff, I think, often likes to be able to have that discretion. I think it allows for flexibility in design.
I'm simply making the suggestion to make sure
Yeah.
that the Director of Public Works has what he needs in
Yeah, and
order
that's,
to
yeah,
exercise
and
his
if when we do look at the law, actual law change, I think that's important to consider, to factor in.
And
Anybody else?
I still use discretion when I do my reviews. I mean, I make sure that if they're proposing a microbioretention area, that it meets the state criteria. You know, that's part of where I use my discretion in making sure. There are times where I go back and forth with engineers about it, saying like, I don't think this one's gonna work here because this is what the code or the standards say, you know, and they will say, well, it will work here. But you have to prove it to me. You have to show me the evidence that's gonna make it work there before we can say, yeah, you go ahead and do that. So that's something that needs to be considered too. It's not just discretion, you know, we shouldn't be worried about opinions of how we would design the site either. That's something I'm firmly against. It's, you know, I'm not gonna tell an engineer this is how you have to design it, you know, but I'll look at it and make sure that it meets the state standards. That's the important thing.
But I feel like we're kind of getting off track here a little bit. Surely you're not suggesting, Mr. City Attorney, that somehow the council is supposed to come up with more standards? I think the state laws and everything.
I'm not suggesting that.
Okay.
I'm responding to the concern that Alderman Savage indicated, that that doesn't seem to be the exercise of discretion in the past, even though it was available. So I'm responding to that by saying perhaps the Director of Public Works needs some criteria in order to exercise that discretion in a meaningful way. I'm trying to help solve the problem as opposed to place
But what would
a
that
requirement on the City Council to establish criteria. Perhaps the Director of Public Works can establish that criteria. He's the person with the administrative expertise to make an administrative decision that an administrative agency or the circuit court would have to give deference to.
Director Gile, you had your hand up?
No, I came up because Alderman Arnett was motioning me to come up. I didn't know if he had a question for me.
Oh, I thought you were standing up wondering if you should
Oh,
come
no, I
off.
was stretching, sorry.
Okay.
But
Or you were wondering if you should take off.
Yeah.
I will add, though, that the reason you don't see case law on these issues is because you have people such as David Gerald, Director of Public Works, they exercise their discretion. In the state law, which we have in our code, we have several criteria he may use in order to exercise that discretion. And there's a dearth of case law on it because lawyers aren't going to challenge these types of decisions, especially when the statute sets forth the reasons when they may exercise their discretion. It would just be a frivolous lawsuit and a waste of money and time on their part, time and money, and on their client's part. So you're not going to see that. And as the city attorney points out, the agency that makes a decision is given a great amount of discretion by the court system.
And deference.
And deference, yes.
To a rational decision. And the rational decision obviously has to be based on something. If the thought is that state law already has the criteria that's sufficient to establish that discretion, so be it. I just want to make sure that we have a department director that's comfortable exercising his discretion with the criteria that have been previously established.
And the other thing is that Montgomery County already has 100% treatment for redevelopment sites. And that we're trying to find out the why on that today. We need to look at the legislative history. But it seems to be able to be accomplished. So if Mr. Gerald were to start to exercise his discretion to ask for more, even it may not be 100%, there probably is a good, solid engineering reason behind those decisions already.
And to shift that a little, go ahead.
Just to clarify, the Montgomery County law does not have any redevelopment. It's all considered new
That's right,
development.
yeah.
Right.
It's all.
And if, just to kind of shift a little bit, so what kind of technologies could they use, what could they do on a site if they had to treat more than 100%?
Everything they treat has to be MDE approved if we want to count it towards the MS4
Mhm.
permit.
So what kind of technologies could they install if they needed
It's
to?
all in the MDE Stormwater Management Manual from 2000,
Yeah.
updated 2009.
I mean, just
And
for
then
the
there's
sake of
also a
the
list
committee
of-
members who aren't as familiar, like what kind of things could they,
There's,
like, bioretention?
it's the same exact type of practices they use. I mean, you have rain gardens, permeable pavement, dry wells, there's microbioretention areas, there's enhanced filters. Those are the main ones. There's reinforced turf, there's other practices. There's a whole entire list that MDE puts out. Hang on one second, I can tell you what the list is called. If you're bored and need something to help you sleep at night. The Alternative Innovative Technology List of Approved Stormwater Management Practices, which was last updated in August of 2017. And that's more of the stuff that has gone through testing by MDE. It's outside the realm of what's in the Stormwater Management Manual in Chapter 5.
And it would be good to know, like, again, when it comes time to actually change the law, is how Montgomery County, how their project sites for redevelopment achieve that extra 50%. How much of a burden is it for them? What do they utilize on their sites? Do they have a variant? Because that's one of my intentions of having it rewording it to be a case-by-case basis, is to give you guys flexibility in terms of the site's more limited, they can't meet it, but I'm curious what other jurisdictions, we don't need to know that necessarily for this resolution, but.
I mean, they still do the same type of practices,
Yeah.
that they can use. It's because they have to be approved by the state. There are practices in there that are only qualified on that list, or that are only qualified for water quality volume and not for recharge volume. So, there's criteria where that's established in there too. There's some practices that can only treat 1 inch, even though they could treat more than 1 inch, but that's all the credit they're gonna get. There's one project right now that I reviewed that had that issue where they were saying, well, we should get more than 1 inch, but that's not what the MDE approval letter or list says.
Alderwoman Tierney, you
Yeah,
had your
thank
hand
you.
up for a
I
while.
just want to step back here for a bit, and you made an important introductory statement, David Jarrell, about how the yacht club, perhaps Primrose, were not due to a stormwater management plan, but to flooding, recent rainfall. In other words, if they had a better stringent stormwater policy, would we have had the issues at Primrose? Because the public believes that. I mean, I have in front of me a testimony from a city resident saying, the stormwater management, failed as far as Primrose, and I'm hearing from you that that's not necessarily the case.
Yes, so what
I
we're
mean, that's
talking
a
about
really
here is
important
the
clarification.
the post-construction stormwater management. So there's a whole separate area, it's
Okay.
erosion sediment control, for during construction, and they have to build temporary holding areas for the stormwater.
Like erosion
It's the most
control.
difficult part
Right.
because that's when the site's unstable.
Okay, so this has nothing really to do with that?
No.
I mean, I know that myself, but I
Yeah,
don't think the
no.
public knows that. I don't
Yeah.
think the public
Yeah.
knows that. I think the public is looking at this as a solution for all of those problems that happen post-review and, whether or not it was inspections or, all these weekend events with the runoff and everything.
So to deal with the construction sites, some of the issues that we've had out there are not stormwater related problems. What they are maintenance issues with the contractors on site,
Yeah.
where they fail to maintain their practices.
Yeah, or one could argue, though, that by increasing the impervious, that they are related somehow. But it's just an important point for the public to know, because they really are looking at this as a solution for that, or at least the people that I talk to say, yes, you've got to fight for this, because look at all the erosion that's happened on Enclave or, Primrose and the Yacht Club project, so.
Yeah, there were some issues out there, that were, like I said, they were maintenance issues on site where,
Yeah.
like an earth dike failed and it caused water to run down the slope and
Okay.
cause erosion on someone's property. And
Yeah.
in those situations, we find the contractor, and then we also, or find the developer, and then we also made the developer go out there and fix those issues.
So it isn't a matter if they had a bioretention pond or something, it would have helped?
No, no,
or
it was
if they-
an earth dike that
something-
failed, and
Okay.
there was debris in front of it, and
Okay.
water got redirected another way that wasn't supposed to go initially, and that ended up causing
Okay.
problems.
And we're gonna get a copy of that MDE letter, David? Yeah. So what they're saying is, they had an important point where if it went up, if you did have to exceed, you have to keep in mind that this might introduce additional structures, which again might introduce additional development that was not your intent. So that's an important point. But let me, my last thing I want to say is, I don't want to conflate the two scenarios that you presented, and let me make sure I understand. The first scenario was that it is sort of status quo with the 50 and the 100%, the status quo as far as the law, but you would be involved early on to discuss more of options within the MDE criteria. Your discretion is still per the MDE code book, if you will, but the law would still say 50 and 100 minimum. The second, okay.
Yeah, no, that's correct. So we would look at each development, so case by case,
Yeah,
and
case
try to
by
figure
case.
out truly what the MEP is. So they wouldn't be limited to just 50%. If they could go above that, then we would try to drive
So the
them
driving
above.
factor, I'm sorry to
Yeah, go ahead.
So the driving factor is not the percentage, it's the
Attainable.
right? It would be what calculation?
Sounds like timing is the issue.
Yeah, no, it's really what practices that they can put on their development. So,
Okay.
so Tom Baum was talking about his development on West Street. It's
Right.
a very limited site.
Right.
It's the one where the sidewalk's blocked off that we all know about.
Thank you for your barricade. Is it
But
still
he's
there?
very limited, so he's put a green roof on the building, but he has no space to put other
Right.
practices, so he had
Right.
a very difficult time even getting up to the 50%.
Okay.
Other ones have more space that the developer can put
Yeah.
practices on.
So
So it
the-
would have to be case by case.
So the second scenario you suggested was if we had the 100 for redevelopment and 150 for new in our code, then you would ask the developer, if they couldn't do that, then a fee in lieu of. So when you start talking like that, then we're acknowledging, and we might as well announce it, that we're making up for lost sins. Do you know what I mean? We have we have an urgency here, and we have to make up, like we're gonna start putting you're asking a developer to do a stormwater mitigation off-site to accomplish maybe 25% that he can't accomplish on his own project. I mean, that's.
Well, I don't think
I
any
don't know, I'm
more
trying
so
to-
than all of the tree discussions we're having, where we, over the years, we've developed Annapolis and removed all the trees, and now we're trying to make up for
Yeah.
all those lost years by adding tree canopy back. I
Yeah.
think it's all the same
It-
thing.
it
We're
is sort
trying
of the
to,
same,
we're trying to help water quality by adding
Yeah,
additional
we are in
treatment.
a
We're
urgent
required by
time.
our MS4 permit to do that, so
Yeah.
we're on the hook to do it, so
Yeah.
maybe development can help with that.
Yeah, and I think that has to be a huge decision by the city. I mean, to acknowledge, instead of kind of like beating around the bush, we're basically saying, we're in crisis mode here, and we've got a stormwater problem, and we're asking you to do X. I mean, that's what the 100 and 150 means to me, is that we're asking you to go above the call of duty, and we're gonna have to do some we're not talking just about your own LOD, but outside of it. So that's what I'm struggling with. So the scenario one, getting back to the scenario one, you wouldn't need any code revision, you would just need probably more staff to do it right. But you would still use, but then we would have to have a consensus, yeah. Yeah, but I think the disagreement I heard from the testimony last city council, where there were a lot of environmentally, learned people saying that the MDE wasn't enough. And I don't know if I agree or disagree with that. And that seems to be a fundamental difference in what your testimony is, that MDE is state law and it's good enough.
Oh, the 50 and
Yeah. I don't know if we'll ever agree. I mean, I agree, but I don't know if there'll be people out there that will agree with that. Do you agree with that, Jackie? Do you think MDE is enough?
No, I think they can do more, and I think we should do more. If we don't do, if we don't.
You speaking into the mic?
Not necessarily, because here's the thing, mitigation off-site's great when absolutely nothing else will work, but we need to try to capture what's on site, so we're not adding to the problem somewhere else. Off-site mitigation, and hopefully off-site mitigation would be limited to the same sub-watershed as well. You don't want to be doing it in the Severn River, it should be happening in the South River watershed either, but, so that's my main point, is you want to capture it where it is and not add to the problem where you're located. And if you're doing off-site mitigation, you have to be careful with that. I don't think anyone really thinks that the state stormwater minimums are enough. I don't think the state believes that. I think they're starting internally to look at it themselves and reevaluate what they could be doing to revamp the law. But I don't think they're going to do it on their own because they don't have enough staff to do it. MDE is woefully understaffed. That's been a contentious issue for a number of years. They were given some money by the General Assembly 2 years ago, which they have yet to use, and Secretary Grumbles has not been able to justify why yet. So they're probably not going to do it on their own. That's why you see Chesapeake Bay Foundation and others showing up here now, because they're going to push the General Assembly to try to force MDE to overhaul the state regulations.
So what context, Matt, did they introduce that shopping list of ad alternates, for lack of a better word?
So they look at a couple different things with that. They make sure that it meets the criteria that they establish for infiltration, and also retention on those practices. That alternative list is things that a private company develops and says, here's my product, and does this, meet the standards, and do we get a letter from MDE saying that we have that approval to be used as a practice? So it goes through testing by MDE to make sure that it meets that. Otherwise, we couldn't use that as a practice in the city.
Okay. All right. I just want to make it clear that David was offering two different scenarios and different,
And one thing too, just to point out too, is you think about most of the development in the city of Annapolis happened before there was stormwater criteria. So, and what sites haven't been developed are those sites that aren't as desirable.
Sure.
So, that it's harder to do some practices on those sites.
I just want to bring in Mr. Iliff, Jesse, who's been sitting patiently, because I think before I turn over to, do you want to go first? Because I know he may want to comment on some of the need, but you want to go ahead while he's getting up. Jesse, you can come up to the podium.
I need to go into spousal wrath management.
Yeah, I'm getting messaged too.
I'm getting very concerned that we have a policy objective that we wanted to achieve, which is not number specific, or at least I'm willing to make it not number specific. But I've heard from the city manager, and we've heard definitely from Director Gerald, now the city attorney, that there's not a comfort level on their part. They're afraid they're going to get caught in an undesirable situation, and we have to listen to that. I mean, these are our people, so we can't put them in an uncomfortable situation. I'm not sure where we go now. We've had a couple of different alternatives thrown out that are not addressed at all in the resolution. Getting involved earlier in the project, which is going to require more staff. I think we needed more staff anyway, but that's a budget time decision. Some downstream or off-site kinds of mediation, that's not in the resolution. I don't know where we are at this point, but I do know we're late in the day.
I know, and
at this point.
But I know Mr. Iliff's been waiting a while, so I want to.
And so is Mr. Hyatt.
Give him some time. Well, I'll do what I can here. I'll give you a few minutes. I'm sorry you had to wait so long, but I know to ground things, your Riverkeeper we have to remember why we're trying to do what we're trying to do. So what have you seen? What
Yeah,
would you like to say?
so, you know, again, for record, Jesse Iliff, South River Federation, a couple of points that I think, you know, people have touched on or already addressed, but bear emphasizing is that all of the creeks and both of the rivers that border the city are impaired for nutrients and sediment. And so whenever there is to be an exercise of discretion on elevating the standards for stormwater management and the development, I think that fact needs to be kept front and center. And something that's interesting that a lot of folks don't seem to know in all the press about how the Bay is making this historic recovery. You know, that's true when you are looking at the Bay as a whole, but all of Anne Arundel County's rivers are lagging behind the curve. And we don't have major agriculture, we don't have major industry in this county. So the fair inference is that the only reason for that is development pressure and stormwater runoff and the management or mismanagement of that. And that's from the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Sciences report card that came out earlier this year. It shows Anne Arundel County has all 4 of the rivers that are in the county, and the 2 that border it are 6 of the 8 in the whole Bay that are falling behind. And I think that most of the folks that I've heard from on this issue and on the forest one earlier today noted that the frequency of intense storms is increasing, and this is not just our anecdotal experience. This is supported by data from NOAA and the EPA, and that phenomenon is especially true for the Northeast, and the way that they break down their maps, Maryland is included in the Northeast. There's also been some discussion during this conversation about how to manage stormwater runoff downstream and whether off-site restoration projects can get us there. And the South River Federation does a great deal of stream restorations and BMP installations throughout our watershed, including in the city. And we are proud of a lot of the good work that we've done, but the basic fact is you got to have both. You can't just fix all of the stormwater management on the land by dealing with it downstream. Even the best and most over-engineered and well-designed stream restoration projects have a limit, just like stormwater management upland does. There's a limit after which point they are no longer treating any stormwater. And so we need to continue to make those investments and to do those projects, but they alone are not going to be able to get us on the road to recovery that we're all trying to get to. So those are my comments, and happy to answer any questions if anybody has any.
And just what have you seen in terms of the storm frequency increase over do you think our laws are keeping pace with that?
No. I mean, I don't have specific data on how much more likely, you know, a 10-year storm is than every 10 years over the past several decades or anything like that. I just, I pulled this report from EPA that found that extremely heavy storms, an undefined term, but have increased in the eastern U.S., including Maryland, by more than 25% since 1958. And you know, they're projecting that that's going to continue throughout the next century. Have a link to that if any of the committee members or broader council are interested. But you know, I mean, clearly our legal framework isn't keeping up with the climate and the weather that we've been having, because if it were, we wouldn't be here trying to figure out how to fix the problems that we're all seeing. And everybody has examples, you know, of stormwater management both during and after construction not being adequate to contain the flows. And you know, one thing that's important to keep in mind also is that after construction, the stormwater management, when a site is all buttoned up, that we're talking about today, when it is discharging and the increase in impervious surfaces leads to the streams being so incised that they become sources of pollution, not just vectors for upland pollution, which is why you need to have the both-and approach with stream restoration and stormwater management on site, because The more impervious surface you put into a watershed, the more you're turning the streams that feed our creeks and rivers into sources of pollution. And that wouldn't be happening if the laws were keeping up to the weather.
Thank you, Mr. Isla, for your testimony.
Sure, my
Appreciate
pleasure.
it. I want to just give Mr. Hyatt, did you want to say anything that you haven't already said in your public testimony? Please keep it very, very brief.
But I'll be quick, because I have to be somewhere myself by 6:30. I just think that, I mean, it's certainly interesting discussion. There's a lot of science involved. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a civil engineer. But I think when you pick these numbers, it gets to be a little bit arbitrary. And again, we had this interesting discussion yesterday with these folks here, and some of the civil engineers, for example, said they have prospective clients come in and talk about redeveloping sites, and they tell them it's just not possible because you're not able to achieve the 50% on redevelopment. So what happens is these old sites just stay in place. There's no stormwater management being practiced, so we miss out on an opportunity. Mr. Baum's project is a good example. I mean, there was no stormwater management on that site, and he managed, I guess he got to 50%, just barely, and if he couldn't, then that project wouldn't happen. So I think, again, you have to look at the context. In the city of Annapolis, there's a lot of properties that have no stormwater management at all, and you want it improved, and if you overdo this, you're going to discourage the redevelopment. So, like everything else, there's implications and complications, and I'd hesitate before I just say, well, let's do 100% and 150%. You're going to cause a lot of problems, I think, and nobody. I mean, maybe we develop the fee in lieu concept. I don't know, but
thank you, Mr.
I'll stop here.
Have we got a deal for you? Because we have an amendment that takes the numbers out.
Yeah, so I do have an amendment, and so just to kind of say, I mean, I think to what Mr. Iliff had said, I'm not even sure if MDE has, it's been a while since they've updated their numbers in terms of our frequency of storms, but.
I was going to ask Matt to clarify, or David, something that Alan just said, if you can't reach 50 or 100, he said that the project doesn't go ahead, but I had this conversation with Matt, because I asked him, I said, what happens when they can't reach their numbers? So what happens, Matt?
So if a project has done everything they possibly can, they can ask for a variance on whether they, do more. It's like, for instance, the one project everyone's talking about is 140 West Street. That project is classified as a redevelopment project. There's two components to it. There's the redevelopment aspect, and then they had a net increase in impervious area, so there was new development that had to be treated there as well. And I have to look at the computations again, but I believe they met the redevelopment requirement portion of it, but the new development portion was not met, and so they asked for a variance on that. And because they were adding stormwater management to a site that did not have any stormwater management, they were reducing the runoff from that site. So in essence, they were making it a better site. They did not quite reach woods in good condition, but that's
with the 50 on the redevelopment and 100 on the new.
Right. We can have a discussion sometime to go over all the numbers and how they go and everything like that. That may be beneficial to the council to understand that a little bit better.
I think you're right.
Yeah, I think what I'm struggling with is, what does the 150% mean to MDE? I mean, does MDE acknowledge the 150?
So
if we could just table that, because I know we will have a
I'll
discussion.
sit down with you, Matt.
Yeah.
Right. We will have a discussion about the numbers.
Sam doesn't
but
have to be there.
I just want to point out one last quick thing too. Is like the reason they use 1 inch for water quality volume is because that's the most credit you're going to get from removing sediment, phosphorus, and nitrogen from a runoff. It's after you get over 1 inch of runoff, it diminishes. Your return's much less. So, for instance, if you go from 1 inch to 2.5 inches for total suspended solids, you're only getting 20% more removal. So that's the argument that MDE was making earlier in the letters, that you increase these, you're going to be increasing the requirement that you're going to have to treat on site, and you're not really getting much more back in that. And the other thing too is that, you can have as many practices in there, if they're not functioning properly, that's where you're having the problems too. And with the the state, I think their stance right now is, we're not gonna increase the standards if we're not properly maintaining the practices that are out there right now, which is why they're holding back on redoing the stormwater management maintenance, or the stormwater management manual.
No, I understand, and I think it's important to clarify though too, if you increase the quantity, capture, how much you're not just treating, but just holding on your site for infiltration, you're still gonna be reducing the amount of runoff that comes off your site and erodes downstream in terms of causing erosion, sediment to be, released from the stream downstream, which also has nutrients. So it's not just, you're kind of reducing the amount of flow that leaves the site if you increase that.
And that would have to be a conversation we have about where do the numbers come from and how do we do the design, because
Right.
basically everything we do in a design is modeling something to make it a woods in good condition for the
Yeah.
soil type that's there.
Right, all right,
There's a insurance company ad on television that says we've had 26 hundred-year storms in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
So it is increasing, and then when we scour out the stream beds, we just really make this order of magnitude higher. But let's do these amendments, because I think it,
Well, and I think we do need to, but I think it still raises the dilemma, like you mentioned. I mean, if we pass this, is this gonna be enough, even as amended, is this gonna be enough for you to use your discretion to ask for more, or are you just gonna, like you said, use your discretion to not use your discretion? I mean, that's kind of the dilemma we face right now. If you're gonna use your, I mean, because what I'm trying to do is, because if that's the case, there's not much reason to pass this. But I mean, I think the implications on other discretionary laws we have in other departments is kind of what concerns me. And what I'm trying to do is establish some kind of legislative intent or legislative clarity. You've got the state. I'm not sure what their legislative intent was entirely, but I'm trying to bring that to our laws in terms of, so you can feel free to use your discretion. But again, what's the purpose if it's not gonna
does
result in
Director
anything?
Gerald know what this amendment is?
I think so.
You do?
And,
Does it make it any better?
I guess what matters right now is what the city manager wants to do with this. So she stayed in the past and she's gone, so I can talk in her stead. But what she said before is if this resolution passes, then she's going to literally direct me to implement those numbers, and if it says maximum extent practicable, then she'll direct me to do that, and we'll change processes where I need more people, and we'll get involved early, and for each project, we'll figure out what MEP is.
Right.
Okay, so I guess in that case, even if we leave numbers in or reduce the numbers, you'd still be using the MEP maximum extent practical standard, and they would still have a variance procedure in place if you had a site where they couldn't meet. So I mean, in that sense, I mean, we could always leave the percentages in there. If this isn't gonna do it, I mean, at this point, I guess I'd like to just find out what the committee.
Actually, what I would like to do, we've gotten a lot of information, new information. I want to do the maximum amount we can do to protect the bay, but I'm not interested in making a off-the-cuff. I would rather we reschedule another meeting within a week or so to have some more time to more thoroughly think this out. We're not gonna do this.
If I could suggest, maybe, I'm very sorry to interrupt, but we had a really good meeting yesterday with, and I think we should bring the environmental side in on that too, but start having the discussions of what
Right.
this, and it needs to be an ordinance, I think, what this ordinance needs to
Okay.
look at on a going forward basis, so we can work out some of those issues without trying to work them out in a
Right.
setting like this.
So you're kind of making my point, you're strengthening it. I'm not ready to make a decision right now. There's too much to consider. And we have to take into account our staff's comfort level and our staff's ability to do their job. If there's not enough staff, we can pass all the ordinances or resolutions we want. They're not gonna be able to do it because they don't have enough people. So I would prefer that we reschedule another meeting to take this up sooner than our next scheduled meeting, hopefully so we can have something ready for November council meeting.
Okay, is that a motion?
That is a motion. That we schedule sometime in the next week or so, another meeting of this committee. I would like to hear the product of the discussion that they had
Yeah.
yesterday. I'd like to have a chance to read the MDE letter. There's just more information, and I think, I don't want to act precipitously just to get something done.
Yeah,
I'd rather try to do it
I
right.
have to agree with that. I think, I mean, I get nervous with two documents, an ordinance and a resolution, and the whole what governs thing, but, I mean, I'm beginning to think here, and hearing the testimony, you know, on the rivers and stuff, I mean, we could do something like, I know Alan's still here, you know, keep the 50, I'm thinking about keeping the 50% on redevelopment, because you don't want to defeat the purpose of abandoning these sites because of the requirement being too high. But then, on new development, you could do the 150 as an upset limit, or I don't know how we would phrase it, with that, fee in lieu of, like, we can't quite get there. This is our, I don't know how you word it in the ordinance, but this is a goal of 150. If you can't get there, it would be such a win-win to have a fee in lieu of, to take care of the other stormwater projects that we can't currently maintain. Am I correct? I mean,
Yeah, no, I
think
think
there's a
that
good, there's a
potentially is a good
win-win here
approach, because
somewhere.
the requirement, you wouldn't want it to be a goal, you want it to be a requirement of 150%, but if you can't make it, then there's a fee in lieu.
Right.
If you can only make 100% because of the site conditions, then you pay the differential as
Yeah.
a fee in lieu, which we then apply to the MS4 projects.
Yeah,
But
Because-
Matt
But I think we should
Matt just threw in new information. You can increase the requirement 100%, but you only get 20% additional return on that. So I need time to
Yeah, no, this is
digest
opening
that
up a
as
whole
well.
new thing, I
And if
think.
we could get that kind of information, I was unaware. I actually thought it was increasing exponentially. You're telling me it's actually decreasing. Yeah, it flattens
Well,
out.
but even what MD was saying is it increases the frequency of storm. I think it was like 3-inch storm at 50% for redevelopment. If you bump that to 100, it's essentially the 3 or 4 or something inch. I forget what they said in the letter. But the point is, I think it's important to raise the percentages for all, because I mean, just to let you know, I think I may have mentioned this, but when it comes time to adjust the actual law, I do want to, if we bump everything to 100%, 150%, if developers kind of fashion it like you do the Forest Conservation Act, if they can't meet that extra 50%, you give them options. There's a fee in lieu of some kind. They can perhaps go to one of these other grandfathered projects, like these apartment complexes that have zero treatment. Maybe they put in treatment there. Maybe they go off-site to put a stream restoration site to treat that extra percent. That kind of, because we need to do something to help us get towards, achieve our TMDLs at as much cost saving as we can to the taxpayer. And that's where I'm trying to get at. But again, my intention with this resolution was just trying to stem the gap. I mean, theoretically, this should be able to get, a resolution should be able to get passed in 2 meetings. 4 weeks,
Not us.
3 to 4 weeks. But in this case, you know, again, just stem the bleeding until we can actually pass the law. This allows you to ask for a little bit more from the developers while we take the time.
I was just
'Cause
gonna
I do want
request,
to communicate,
just Alderman
Director
Savage.
Darrell, I do want to communicate with you and Matt and everybody about how to change the actual law down the road. That takes
I don't know
time.
when you're planning to reschedule this meeting, but, you know, to
Take
give
a
us a week to at least look into some of the
Yeah.
information, especially I'd like to see how Montgomery County got to their across-the-board 100%.
Yeah.
Because I do not want to abandon an increase for redevelopment sites. I'd love that all the sites were redevelopment sites, so we don't want to disincentivize them.
Yeah.
But I think, obviously, if Montgomery County, which is a very sophisticated county, can get there, why shouldn't we be able to do it too? And if it means that in some cases, well, Matt's just said, you know, the project doesn't go away. Projects around here just don't go away. They grant a variance, or we will give them options. And maybe it isn't, you know, 100%, maybe it's something else, but we should figure out how Montgomery County got there. So just give us at least a week.
We
Yeah,
have time
we have
because
time
the
even-
first
we have even
council
more
meeting
time, I think, too.
in November is the
Like
19th.
yeah, something like that.
So,
we have plenty of time.
yeah, you tell us how much time you need,
Yeah.
and then we'll work with
Get back to us.
Takia and
So,
about
Takia, we're not going to
rescheduling.
reschedule at the moment, if that's okay. But Alderwoman, are you willing to second the motion to postpone?
Yeah, I second that. Yeah, did you
Okay,
motion?
there's no motion needed to postpone, so we're just going to postpone.
Ross,
Oh,
you
no
did-
one made it, Ross?
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
All right, well, I still, that we're gonna reschedule it.
So withdraw your first motion and then make another motion.
What's the difference between
Well, nobody
rescheduling and
seconded the
postponing?
first one anyway. So just make the new motion to.
That we postpone our decision
I
until our
second.
next meeting.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Matt, I will meet with you to
Um,
just learn a little bit
I'll
about
entertain
it.
motion to
See,
adjourn.
Alan, you should know, your powers of persuasion are not nearly as much as my wife's powers of persuasion.
Get a motion to adjourn.
Oh, I motion that we adjourn.
Second, all those in
Second.
favor? Aye.
I was compromising, Rob.